Welcome to TSG Live Model Railroading, a program to share ideas and ask fellow modelers about their approach to the hobby. Sit back, relax, and prepare to be inspired.
We have a little bit of a dark space there before we get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. This is TSG Live Model Railroading. I'm John, your host, and today we're going to be talking to my friend Mike Roqué, who's going to talk to us all about understanding railroad signals. So this ought to be interesting. Mike has this clinic that he gives. I had a chance to sit in on it a few months ago and found it to be pretty interesting. Hopefully you will too. I was, believe it or not, pretty riveted by it because when I'm out rail fanning, I usually try to read the signals. And if you don't know what you're looking at, it's a lot harder to do that. So anyway, let me bring Mike in. And there he is. Hello, Mike. Good morning.
Howdy. Morning, John.
How's it going, man?
Pretty good. Nowhere I'd rather be on a Saturday morning than broadcasting with you.
Oh, nowhere or you know where?
Sure.
Right, exactly.
Good one.
Yeah, well, I mean, I gotta make sure I understand what you're saying there, Mike.
Exactly.
So why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about yourself, and then we can get started.
Sure. Well, I'm Mike Roqué. I like to think I know a couple things about railroading, but always learning every day. But always been a fan of signals. I grew up in New York City, sort of riding the New York City subway, which has its own interesting signal system. And so just always been a fan of how that all works, all the mechanics of it and what lets trains keep going, basically. So kind of started there, and I grew up next to the former New York Central Main Line. It was Conrail when I was a kid in the 80s, but a lot of stuff was going on then. They were getting rid of their signals then and going to cab signals and stuff, or I should say getting rid of their wayside signals, and ended up moving upstate to Rochester, New York, where I really got exposed to freight and sort of mainline railroading there. And we had a great model railroad club there. The RIT Model Railroad Club was excellent. And there was also a railroad museum there where I got to actually play with vintage trains and run old locomotives and stuff, which was really a lot of fun. So my interest has always been with model railroading and signals and operations and just everything about railroading. Trains are fun, right? I don't have to sell anybody on that, I think, here. And I hope not.
We have a biased audience here, so I think
so.
shouldn't be too hard to win them over.
Right on. So yeah, I lived in Rochester for about 10 years on the CSX main line, the old water level route. And then I moved to Sacramento about 10 years ago and kind of fell in love with the Southern Pacific and all the Western roads, really, but kind of modeled the Southern Pacific and always enjoyed what they did with signals and with everything. And, each of the railroads out here kind of approached it a little bit differently. We'll talk about that a little bit in the clinic, about how different railroads' signal rules tell you a lot about the railroad that you're dealing with. And now I pretty much, my model railroading efforts are based on the Sacramento Model Railroad Historical Society here in Sacramento. We have a large HO layout where we model Oakland to Keddie on a double deck railroad. So we basically have the Southern Pacific on the lower deck and the Western Pacific on the upper deck. And it's a lot of fun. We're actually rebuilding a CTC machine. I know we've talked about that, John. We'll probably cover that at some point in the future, but that's about half done. But for now, we run JMRI, and we have a computer that runs the signals. We use CMRI to drive our wayside signals, and we have CTC on about 80% of the layout now. And so about once a month, we have an operating session on the first Friday there, and I usually dispatch. I'm sort of the operations manager guy. I used to be a director, but I'm off the board, but I'm still chained to the organization.
Well,
but
you want to be involved still.
Yeah.
So
no, it's nothing more fun than an op session on a CTC railroad, or train orders are fun too. But as far as signaling goes, dispatching with we actually have the real Western Pacific machine that we're restoring to operation, which is a lot of fun.
Yeah, I know that I've showed that at least once or twice on my podcast from trips when I was up there, probably pre-COVID, but because it's been a while now. But yeah, looking forward to seeing when that is done. I know that we've talked in the past about doing a layout tour at the layout and possibly doing a model railroading 101 video about CTC, so that should be fun too. And I think now that COVID's sort of sundowning, maybe we'll get out there and do that sometime, maybe even this year. I guess it depends when the CTC machine's ready, right?
Yeah, they've been working on it. The hardware team's been doing a lot of work over the last year. We had a little bit of a slowdown because of COVID. We just couldn't get in there and work together. But it's mainly just wiring it up. I mean, the machine is basically ready. We just have to make all the wire connections, and then once that's done, then I can do the actual programming. But I've done it twice before already, so it shouldn't be too hard. But that'll take some time. We're kind of shooting for the end of this year. If things go well, I think that could happen. But my hands are tied until the hardware guys finish. Then I'll do the software, and then we can shoot some great video. That'd be awesome.
Right, and you're a computer guy too, so it seems like it shouldn't be too hard for you. Is it pretty simple sort of functions that you have to program into something like that?
Yeah, it's not conceptually difficult, and yeah, I'm a software engineer for a living, but JMRI, it's point and click. They automate a lot of it with their signal mask logic. You can basically draw your layout and plant signals on it, and they kind of know what to do. And then for the CTC machine, you can program what they call logixes, Logix, and you basically, if this and not this, then do this. It's very easy. Right. What we call Boolean logic. So it's not terribly hard. It's hard because the interface to the software is a lot of sort of clicking around. It'd be a lot easier if I could just write code, but JMRI is built so that anybody can use it, and it runs on Java, so it can run on anybody's computer. It's meant for the general audience, not for a software engineer like me. So it's kind of a trade-off, but no, it's really not that hard. The complexity comes in the scale and the scope, and you just have to know all of the little things to check. What do I have? What is the actual logic? That's really where the hard part is. Programming JMRI is relatively simple if you know what it is that you want it to do. So should be a lot of fun. And like I said, I've already built it once in software. So the real trick is getting it to behave in a prototypical fashion. But like other aspects of model railroading, you have to do some amount of selective compression, not to do a clinic on a CTC machine, but certain things, like if you take away a signal from a train, the machine usually runs time. It will not let you clear that signal again for up to 5 minutes in some cases. And on most model railroads, that's way too long. And even 10 seconds is an eternity in a model railroad context. So we don't run time. We don't do certain other safety checks. Nobody's going to die if somebody runs a red signal. So it's not like it's critical.
It depends though. I mean, if you get two guys with brass engines and they do a head-on collision, they might have heart attacks. So
yeah, there might be a duel afterwards, but that's not directly a result of the wreck. So yeah, everybody always brings up the brass locomotive example. Yeah, that's what insurance is for.
So, here's the real trick though, which is in order to understand how you need to program that thing, you need to understand how the signals are supposed to work, and that's really what we're here to talk about today. So maybe if you want, you could bring that up and we can get started on that, because again, I do think it's an interesting topic, and it'll be fun. I remember seeing this. The clinic is a lot of information, and we're going to probably try to take it a little bit slow, and if we have to, if we can, I may even ask some questions now and again just to make sure that I'm getting this, because I remember when I watched it the first time, I after about halfway through, I was like, okay, I've reached my
saturation.
Exactly. Well, it's not that as much as trying to keep up. So but I also realize I'm kind of dumb. So we're gonna dumb it down for me this time.
No, we should definitely take it slow if we've got the time. It can be like drinking from a fire hose. If you're new to signaling, it's a lot of heavy concepts to get your mind around. But that being said, it's pretty simple. I mean, I guess we'll just roll right in here. One of my favorite quotes that I've ever heard is on the screen here. If the signal's not all red, then it's not red at all. And what that basically means is that, when you look at a signal, basically one of two things is true. You can either go or you can't. And if you can't, that's stop, right? All red, everything, stop, stay, put your feet up, grab a cup of coffee, you're not going anywhere. Every other thing that a signal can tell you allows you to go. It's just a question of how far, how fast, and what else it tells you. And that's what we're going to talk about. So I really like that quote, and it really it really gets the point across, I think, succinctly. One of the other great quotes that I've ever heard is, as soon as the first railroad got their second engine, they knew they had a problem, right? So what I take that to apply to is really the concept that signals allow trains to proceed, right? We think about lights like driving a car. You think, oh, it's about stopping you. It's not. It's really about allowing you to go. And that's what signals do. They allow trains to proceed safely as quickly as possible. And that's pretty much the business that railroads are in. So that's kind of the way I like to introduce this stuff. I'm still trying to figure out where this picture is from. If anybody knows where this is, it looks like Arizona or maybe Southern California, like in LA. I want to say it looks like Fullerton or something, but I don't think it is. Does anybody know where this is? I have not been able to identify this location. So if you want to kill some time, we can guess where this is. It's even more fun if people give wrong answers only. But I don't know where this is, but this is sort of the best signal bridge shot I could find. So if anybody knows where this is, bonus points for me. But anyway, if you want, we can get started.
Yeah, we should get started. One thing I do want to mention that was kind of an epiphany for me the first time I saw the clinic was, you kind of alluded to it a minute ago, which is how different railroad signals are compared to the signals that we see when we're driving. Mm-hmm. Because I remember when I first started observing railroad signals, I was pretty mystified. It's like, wait a minute, if it's flashing red, why are they going?
Right, right.
Because flashing red to me as a driver means stop here, and they're going to stop. Well, they're not always going to stop, but if they have a flashing yellow, they have to slow down at least. But you know what I'm saying? Like,
right.
That's one of the things, and I think that the point that railroads really are in the business of moving things as efficiently as possible. So it makes a lot of sense to me that they would have it be, go, but go slowly, or something like that. And I know you're going to cover that, but that was just an epiphany for me that maybe people watching can be on the lookout for. So
that's a great point. I would say this. Obviously, cars and trains are different, but in the way that they're different, specifically related to signals, is that trains can't stop very quickly, right? So the signals need to account for that. They need to account for, we don't cover this in this clinic. This is more of an engineering concept, but trains need to be able to stop and comply with signals. And if they can't, the signals need to protect that train that can't stop, let's say, if the signal were to drop to stop for whatever reason. Whereas in your car, you mash on the brakes, most cars can stop pretty quickly. Train can take a mile or two to stop. So one of the things we'll touch on a little bit in the clinic is why they tell you what they tell you, why the engineer needs to know certain things, and not only how that provides safety, but it also provides that efficiency. It's really safety and efficiency. Mm-hmm. And because trains are so big and the territory might be hilly, it might not be, it might be curvy, there's all types of characteristics that go into deciding how a signal system will work. What we're here to talk about today is more larger principles about what the information is and how it works. But that's a great point, because basically, again, signals need to be designed with the idea that a train might not be able to stop. That's why we've got to have several signals. Cars, it's a little bit different. We can just say yellow and then, hey, probably stop, and wait a second before giving the other guy the green, and the other drivers can see and not go if somebody's flying through the red light. Trains can't do any of those things. So that's really a great point to make, is that we've got to account for the sheer mass of what we're dealing with and the speeds involved. Cars are usually not going quite as fast, or at least not with so much mass at so much speed. So yeah, we're going to talk about all of that a little bit.
Please proceed, sir.
All right, very good. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about. Let's talk about some concepts. We'll start with these basics, and if you can understand these things, a lot of the other things will make a lot more sense. We'll talk about what aspect, name, and indication means, how we describe signals, basically, and what they tell you. The concept that three heads represent three speeds or three different routes. There's often sort of, I don't want to call it a debate, but a distinction between speed signaling and route signaling. We'll talk about how those are kind of the same thing at the end of the day, but what the three heads really mean. You'll notice that you almost never, there are some examples of four heads, but generally speaking, you have three heads, and the concept will make it a lot clearer and make it a lot easier to understand how to think about signals. And then, of course, three colors, right? Red, yellow, and green, what those mean. And then we'll expand on that to see how railroads use those same three heads to communicate 5 different speeds. So those are some basic concepts we'll talk about, and then we'll look at some specific signal rules. We're out here in California, so most of the audience that I deliver this clinic to is a California, either model railroaders or rail fans. So the Southern Pacific and the Western Pacific practices are pretty prevalent. We do have the Santa Fe here as well, but the SP and the WP are much more prevalent in California. So that's what I tend to focus on, and it's a great example of how we can see the contrast between two similar but different sets of signal rules. And then we'll talk about the actual signaling systems. Once we get done figuring out, all right, what do individual signals mean, let's look at those signals in the context of the entire system, or the entire railroad, or a large chunk of railroad. So we'll talk about automatic black signals, which are generally referred to as ABS, as one system or one type of signals. And then we'll talk about absolute permissive block, which builds on ABS to provide some additional features and safety. And then we'll talk about interlockings and centralized traffic control, which is sort of how we really approach signaling in general these days. To understand CTC, you have to understand what an interlocking is. So each of these things will build on the previous thing and really allow us to get a good overview of how signals work in the context of the larger railroad. So let's talk about some of those concepts. And if you guys have any questions or anything, feel free to post it in the chat, and we can answer them along the way. I'm going to try and take our time here and really slow it down here and make sure that we take each of these pieces in turn, because it can be a lot if we go too quickly here. So let's talk about some basic stuff. This is pretty straightforward. Aspect, name, and indication. Aspect is what a signal looks like. What are the colors and in what positions, right? So if we have yellow over green, right, or green over red, or just green, or just yellow, right? We'll talk about in a minute how we can maybe not necessarily have three heads. We can have up to three heads, but we may not have all three. But the point is, aspect is what it looks like, as opposed to its name, which is generally given by the railroad's rule book. The railroad has specific sections in the rule book with just signal rules, and those signal rules will tell you, if you see this signal, here's what it's called, and here's what you do. And that's what the name and the indication is. So the name might be approach medium for yellow over green, and we'll talk about what that means in a little bit, but that's its name, and then its indication is what to do. In this particular case, the rule book would probably read something like, proceed prepared to pass the next signal at medium speed and take the diverging route. So aspect, name, and indication. So when we see yellow over green, we think, that's approach medium, and what we do is proceed prepared to blah, blah, blah. Got that? Aspect, name, and indication. What you'll find is that, especially among rail fans and sometimes among railroaders, aspect and name are kind of used interchangeably. Sometimes they'll say, all right, yellow over green, or, approach medium, or, slow clear, whatever it might be. But as a matter of academic precision, aspect and name are two different things. What it looks like and what it's called. And then, of course, the indication is what you do. And that's really all it boils down to in terms of the engineer understanding what to do when he or she sees a particular signal. What am I looking at? What is it called? And then what do I do when I see that? Aspect, name, and indication. All right, so here's the real key to understanding sort of the positioning, right? What do the three heads mean, right? Why don't we have seven? Why do we need more than one? Well, if you can imagine a scenario where you have a switch in front of you or a turnout in front of you, let's say there's two, there's three possible routes, right? You can go down the main, right, or the high-speed route, the primary route, the main track, or you could maybe go into a siding, or maybe some third route into a yard, or maybe some unsignaled branch line, something like that, some slower speed route. And that's basically the idea here. So the higher on the mast, the higher the speed, right? So typically the top head is the high speed or maximum speed route. Typically, on a main line, a high-speed main line, that'd be over 50 miles an hour, 45 miles an hour. Medium speed route would be a route that you could take that's not the main track, but still maybe a siding, and the switch is good for 30 miles an hour. That'd be a medium speed route. And then a slow speed route, or into a yard or some other than main track route where you'd have to go slow. Maybe it's a sharp curve, right? And we need the train to slow down to 15 miles an hour to take that route at that slow speed. So we'll talk about it a little bit later about speed versus route signaling. And basically the bottom line is whether the signal tells you what the speed is, or whether you're supposed to know, okay, at this particular location on the railroad, this turnout is good for 30, or this turnout's good for 50, or what have you. It's really a question of whether you have to know the speeds in the territory yourself. But the concept here is that the three heads govern those three different routes or three different speeds. Generally speaking, the railroads back east used speed signaling, which meant that in the case of, say, the medium speed route, if the middle signal is green, right, what that tells you is the medium speed route is good. You're clear to go through that at 30 miles an hour. So all the engineer needs to know is, whenever I see that, I've got to get down to 30 miles an hour, or I can't pass that signal at more than 30 miles an hour. On the West Coast, they tend to use what's generally referred to as route signaling, where, okay, the second signal says you're diverging, you're not taking the main track, and it's up to you, the engineer, to know on the particular territory at that particular location what the proper speed is. Some of them, they're typically the same. In other words, most of them might be 30 or most of them might be 40, and then there'll be exceptions. So it's not as hard as you might think. The point is, the signal tells you which way you're going, and you're supposed to know what the proper speed is, versus, say, on the New York Central back east, it's speed signaling. It just tells you what the speed is. And a lot of that has to do with the topography of the railroad, right? The New York Central's railroad is a lot different than, say, the C&O, right? The New York Central's got a big 4-track high-speed main line from New York to Chicago, whereas, say, like the C&O or some coal hauler railroads up in the mountains running coal trains at 15 miles an hour, a real slow speed, and their signaling is going to be a little bit different. So, and especially out west here, like the Santa Fe was, pretty much a mostly flat, mostly high speed in the middle of nowhere kind of railroad. And so their signaling system is a little bit different than, say, the Western Pacific, which is similar, but they go through a few more mountains. They had a little bit less money, and the Southern Pacific's kind of in the middle. But, each railroad would customize its approach to signaling based on that. And the Western railroads tended to use route signaling, whereas the Eastern railroads tended to use speed signaling. But enough about speed and route signaling. The key here is 3 heads and 3 speeds. Understand what those 3 positions on the mast mean. Top is the main, the medium, or the middle is the medium or diverging route, and the bottom is the slow or tertiary route. That makes sense? It'll make a lot more sense. Yeah.
I have a question though. So
sure.
you only would have, because I've been in places where you have only one signal. Mm-hmm. Does that just mean there's no diverging routes for like a long distance, basically?
Immediately ahead of the signal, that's right. The signal, there's only as many heads as there are possible routes. So if you're in the middle of some single track section somewhere, and there's what we call an intermediate signal, there'd just be one head on it, because you can only go down the main track, right? Whereas if you're, say, approaching a control point where there's a siding, right, there's 2 routes, so there'd have to be at least 2 signals. And if there's 3 routes, you would need 3 signals. And if there's 3 or more, let's say there were 4 different routes, usually there'll be 3 heads, and the 2 tertiary routes would use the bottom head. We'll talk about that in detail in a second, but you're exactly right. The signals may be omitted if there aren't that many routes. Now, there are scenarios, we'll see in a little bit, and I don't really touch on this in detail, but since you asked, imagine a place where you have a siding, right? There'll be a 2-headed signal at that siding, right? Approaching it, facing the turnout. The previous signal before that will probably also have 2 heads. And the reason for that will become clear when we start talking about some of the rules, or some of the indications, I should say aspects that you can see, where it can basically tell you ahead of time, hey, am I going to diverge at the next signal? Whereas a single head won't be able to tell you that. That second head gives you additional information. Even though there's one route, it tells you more about what the next signal is, or what your speed has to be for the next signal. So yeah, that's a good question, and we're going to cover that in detail in just a minute. So let's talk about the colors, right? We talked about the 3 heads. Each head can have 3 colors, red, yellow, or green. I don't think I'm breaking any new ground here. I think anybody who knows what a railroad signal is understands that's what you see. And what does that mean? The color itself means how many blocks ahead are clear. Red means 0, right? And I showed an example track layout here. You'll see this a bunch of times in this presentation. So we can see, for example, this train here, right? The arrows are trains. The green is sort of the authorized path that the signals allow. So like this train here is going east. He's lined up into the siding, right? And this westbound train is lined up on the main. We're setting up a meet here. But as far as the colors go, you can see behind this train, this signal has to be red, because 0 blocks ahead are clear. You usually say the route is impassable. You can't proceed past that, right? Whereas behind this, the yellow signal, there's 1 block clear, but the next block is occupied. So yellow tells us that we have only 1 clear block ahead. And green will tell us we have at least 2 blocks clear. So that's why this signal here, there's a block here that's clear, there's a block here that's clear, and then the train is occupying the following block. So those colors tell us basically how far we can go, and in a roundabout way, it tells us how fast we can go. What the signal rules, as we'll see, will tell us is yellow by itself typically means expect the next signal to be red. And it will tell you things like you must immediately reduce speed to medium speed, 30 miles an hour, something like that. And so it tells you how many blocks are clear, but it implies what is to come next and what action you must take. So again, red, 0, right? The next block is occupied, or the switches aren't lined for us. That's another reason that the route might be impassable, right? Yellow says 1 block is clear, and green means 2 or more are clear. Pretty straightforward, I think. So let's get into some rules. Let's get into the actual signal rule. So this is our first signal rule. Its name is stop, and its aspect is red, or red over red, or red over red over red. And what that means is all 3 routes are impassable, right? Maybe the switch isn't lined up, maybe we're not authorized to go, or maybe there's a train ahead. But we have to stop and wait at that signal, right? We cannot proceed at all. That is the most restrictive indication you can get. There's nothing worse than stop, right? And as John asked earlier, perfect question, 3, red over red over red, or red over red or red are all stop. We may have multiple aspects for the same signal name. So the signal name is stop, the indication is stop, but the aspect might be red, or it might be red over red, or it might be red over red over red, or it might be a semaphore that's at a certain position. I don't show semaphores here, but the point is that we might have multiple aspects for the same signal name and indication. So that was a great question there, John. So the basic point is that the other heads might be omitted if those routes don't exist, right? So the top one might be single track. This one might be something you see approaching a siding, where there's the main route and the siding route. And then you might be in a terminal somewhere, or some complicated piece of trackage where there's 3 routes: the main route, the secondary route, and the tertiary route. You don't see this too much out west, but back east, sometimes you'll see a top head and a bottom head and no middle head. In other words, there's a high-speed main route, and then there's only a tertiary slow route. And what they'll do is they'll omit this middle head and leave space there, as opposed to this, where they're in the 1-2 position, will be in the 1 and 3 position. So we'll see in a minute how those rules can show. But the important thing to understand is that the signals might be omitted if those routes don't exist. Right?
I have a quick question that might be kind of a dumb question, but so out here, if you, and I think you mentioned this before, but I just want to be clear about it. So if I'm operating the train and I come up on a red signal, I would have had a yellow or flashing red or something prior to let me know, hey, it's going to be red, so you better slow down because you're going to have to stop. So that when I come to the solid red, I know that that I'm slowed down enough that I can stop there. You said that earlier, right?
We touched upon it a little bit, yeah. Okay. Typically, if nothing goes wrong, yes, you should never find yourself on top of a stop signal at speed. Right. That's the whole point of all these different signal rules we're going to talk about in a minute, is preparing the engineer to respond to those conditions and slow down or take the appropriate action to comply with that signal. So yeah, typically before a stop, you'll see approach or something more restrictive than clear. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But yeah.
Yeah, got it. I just wanted to make sure I had that clear in my head because, I guess it's kind of like if you wanted to make a comparison to our traffic signals on the road, mm-hmm. what you're getting in the block that you just came out of is like that. Like if in traffic signals on the road, yellow tells you better slow. Well, it depends where you are, I guess.
Yeah.
Sometimes yellow means floor it to some people.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
But what it really means is, hey, the light's going to turn red. You better slow down. So really, what we're talking about is, let's call it block 1. You would have something there on a signal that says, "Hey, guy with this 100 some odd ton train or whatever 1,000-ton train, you better slow down because it's going to be red when you get up to the next one." So that's all. I just wanted to be clear about that.
No, that's exactly right. It's kind of like the yellow signal in the traffic light before it goes to red. It doesn't go from green to red, right? You've got to get some kind of warning. And for cars, that few seconds of yellow is typically enough. And of course, it depends on the speed of the road, right? If you know anything about highway engineering, different lights on different speed highways will have a longer or shorter yellow. On a 10, 20 mile an hour road, it might be, I don't know, 2 seconds or something. On a 50 mile an hour road, it might be 4 or 5 seconds to give the cars enough time to either stop or to get through it before it turns red. So we have the same concept with railroads. You'll typically get an approach or a yellow. We'll talk about it in just a minute here. But yeah, you never, unless something goes wrong, a signal will never get worse in front of you. Sometimes it'll get better, but you never want it to get worse. And even if it does get worse, the signal system is designed to, as I talked about earlier, run time. So if a signal drops to red, right, for whatever reason, the signal system will not allow the dispatcher to clear that signal again until that train either has enough time to stop or to blow through it safely without another conflicting route being set up. And it looks like we have a question from Bernard C. here. Yes, the top is always for the main or the primary route. It's usually the main track, right? Typically, not to go too wonky here, but if we're in main track territory, we're not in a yard somewhere, that's typically where you have signals. There are signals in other places, sometimes in yards, that do different things. But as far as the main line is concerned, yeah, the top head is almost always the main route or the fastest route, let's say, right? It's the highest speed route, typically the maximum authorized speed route, and then you have slower routes in the second and third position, exactly. So yeah,
I guess a key difference between cars and trains is that if we see a yellow light on the traffic signal when we're driving our cars, we can get away with speeding up to try to get through it as long as the cops aren't there to catch you going through the red light. But on a train, you don't want to even consider doing something like that because that's a deadly proposition.
That's exactly right. Signals when it comes to railroading and speed limits and frankly all the rules. The saying is that all railroad rules are written in blood, and what the meaning is that every rule that is in the railroad book, and there are hundreds of them, is written because somebody got hurt or killed before that rule was in place. And when it comes to signals and speed limits, obviously we can't allow trains to go over speed because they'll fly off the track, right, and derail and cause a great amount of damage and possibly injury and death. So it's serious business, and it's the same thing with the signal indications. As we'll see a little bit, there are signal indications that allow you to stop and proceed or proceed at a slow, careful speed. We'll call it restricted speed. We'll talk about that in a minute. But yeah, there is no room for bending of rules on the railroad. Speed limits are absolute and signal rules are absolute. We'll talk a little bit about absolute signals versus permissive signals in just a little bit. So for example here, stop is stop. That's an absolute signal. You must stop and stay. You cannot pass the signal. We'll see in a little bit there are more permissive signals that allow you to either stop and proceed or to just proceed through it at a slow speed called restricted speed. So yeah, that's a great segue. Let's move right along. Stop is the most restrictive indication that we can get, and clear is the opposite end of the spectrum. It is the most permissive or the best indication that we can possibly get. So, high green, a lot of times people will call that, and a green on the top of the mast basically says that the high-speed route is clear ahead for at least 2 blocks. So we can see our example here. Back here, this train is looking at a clear signal because the next 2 blocks are clear. If we imagine that none of these other trains were here, all these signals would be green, right? And what that basically tells the engineer is you've got at least 2 blocks before you have to stop. And typically the blocks are spaced based on the speeds of trains and the braking distance of those trains, so that the engineer does have the ability to stop in time for any stop signal that they may find. So clear is the best signal we can get. And then we'll start working our way down from there. So this is where it gets a little bit more complex. I don't want to say complicated, because once we understand the concept of the 3 colors and the 3 positions, we'll actually be able to predict what the signals mean in terms of their name. And, what I always like to say at the beginning or about this point in the presentation is you probably can't tell the difference right now between approach medium and medium approach, but by the end of this clinic, you'll be able to know what the difference is. So let's talk about medium clear, right? We started here with clear, it's green on top. We're going down the high-speed route, down the main typically. Medium clear is a situation like this where we are diverging typically, and the speed of the turnout is medium speed, or let's say 30 miles an hour, right? So that's what we would see here. We would see the middle head is green because, well, the top head can't be green because the switch is not lined for that route, for the straight or main route, right? It's impassable. So that means that the top head has to be red. Can't be anything but red if the switch is lined against it, right? And the medium speed route, the switch is lined, so it can be better than red. And we assume for this example that there are at least 2 blocks ahead or clear, so it can be green. If there was only 1 block ahead, it would be yellow in the middle. We'll see that in just a minute. But there is really no low speed route here. So that has to be red as well. So we've left with no choice but to have red over green over red. You see how that makes sense here? It's about the colors and the positioning, right? There's no other possible scenario that we can say here at this crossover based on those conditions. So that's what medium clear is here, right? And we'll see over here what this signal means in just a minute. That's our approach medium. I'll give it a little teaser here. We'll bring that up again in just a moment. So that's medium clear. And then slow clear is basically the same idea, but let's imagine that this turnout was only good for, say, 15 miles an hour. This is a really sharp crossover, or slow speed crossover. We would want to show the green in the bottom position to show that it's only good for that speed, as opposed to the middle head, which would be medium speed, right? And again, in a speed signaling versus route signaling scenario, right? If this was the New York Central, all the engineer needs to know is I see this signal, I can't go more than 15 miles an hour. Maybe I'm diverging, maybe I'm not. I don't care. All I care about is get down to 15 miles an hour. On the West Coast or anywhere you would have route-based signaling, this signal tells the engineer, you're diverging at the tertiary route and you better know what the speed is. Maybe it's 15, maybe it's 20, whatever it is, but the engineer has to know. But at the end of the day, it basically tells you the same thing. You're taking the slow or third tertiary route, right? And again, we can see here, let's say this is a slow crossover. It can't be the top head because the main route is not clear. It's the switch is lined against it. And the medium route, well, this isn't a medium route. There really isn't one, if you will. And so we're forced to put the non-red head at the bottom, and we assume 2 blocks are clear in this example, so it has to be green. And back here, you can see this double yellow. We're not really going to talk about this, but this is called approach slow. Basically, it tells you that the next signal is going to be a slow clear, right? We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in just a minute. So just to recap. Sure.
Yeah, I have a quick question. So one of the things that we hear about here, and I'm assuming they probably do this on the East Coast as well, is people getting qualified to run on the line. That's what you're referring to when you say that the engineer needs to know what the speed of that turnout is, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Qualification, you've got to obviously know the route, sort of know all of the features of it, you know, grades, curves, you know, crossings, anything that might impact the safety of the train. And then, of course, the signal rules, which are generally railroad wide, or, you know, the scope of the signal rules is typically at least division wide, if not railroad wide. These days where you have, you know, railroads like the UP, which sort of swallowed up a million different railroads with a million different signals, you'll find that their signal rules are a mile long, compared to, say, the Western Pacific, which was pretty much their own thing, and their rules were about shorter. I think they had only about 10 rules or something like that. With the UP's rules, there's like 50. I mean, it's it's crazy. So yeah, qualification has to do with knowing the physical characteristics of your railroad as well as the operational characteristics, which include signals and any other operating practices that might be relevant to that particular area. So yeah, good question. You know, again, the idea with speed signaling back east was that it simplified that, right? All I need to know is what speed can I pass this signal. That removes the need to know really anything else, right? If this track's good for 15, it's good for 15. I don't have to know that. The signal tells me that. And that's kind of what the New York Central's approach was that I was most familiar with, what I grew up with, and what this clinic was actually based on originally. Out west, you tend to have more diverse, you know, you've got some of the railroads in the mountains, some of the railroads in the valley, some of it's across the desert. You know, there's just sort of more to know in more different cases, and it's a lot easier to have a simpler route-based signaling system, and then the engineers know their territory very well, and it's actually more efficient for them. So it's sort of 2 different approaches that make sense based on, you know, where you are and the nature of railroading in those regions. So yeah, good questions. This is much more depth than I normally go into with this, which is fantastic because, you know, this is generally geared to model railroaders, but this audience, we're speaking to rail fans and more of a general interest. So these are great questions. So we talked about clear, medium clear, slow clear. Let's get into approach. So what does approach mean? Well, as we talked about before, the yellow signal or the yellow head means that the route ahead is only clear for 1 block. Right? So we can see here there's a train in this block. So the signal behind him has to be at red because 0 blocks ahead are clear, the signal behind it can only be yellow because there's only 1 block clear, and it's 1 head because there's only 1 route. So it has to be a single head and it has to be yellow, and that's what we call approach, right? Is 1 yellow signal on the top. In this case, there's only 1. In this case, there's 3, but it's the same signal. It's still approach. And we'll talk about what it means, but basically the rules usually say something like, be ready to stop at the next signal. Expect the next signal to be red. So we can see this guy's got an approach here because there's a train 2 blocks ahead. This guy's got an approach because there's a switch against him and an approaching train in the other direction. But even if this train wasn't here, if this switch was lined for the siding, this signal would have to be red, right? Because the route ahead is impassable. So if this is at red, or it's stopped, let's say, then necessarily the previous signal has to be at approach because there's only 1 block ahead that's clear, and the engineer will have to slow down and stop for this next signal. What we're going to see in a minute is signals like approach medium that allow the engineer to know that the next signal is a slow speed, but it's not at stop. But let me not get ahead of myself here. This is approach. This is the basic idea behind approach. It's approach the next signal expecting to stop is essentially what it's short for, right? And so here's approach medium. This might be my favorite indication because it really combines all of these concepts into one idea. So approach medium is this signal over here. It's yellow over green. And why is that? Well, in this scenario, right, look what we've got coming up ahead. We've got a medium clear, right? This switch is good for medium speed, let's say. So this has to be red over green. And in this case, there's a third head, red over green over red. But the medium speed route is clear for 2 blocks. Well, what about back here at this signal? Why is the top head yellow? Well, the high speed route is clear to the next signal, but it's not clear past that signal, right? Because this switch is lined for a less than high speed route, right? So the main route, the top head is only clear for 1 block. So the top head has to be yellow, right? It can't be green because there aren't 2 blocks, and it can't be red because it's passable for at least 1 block. Therefore, it has to be yellow. The question is, why is the middle head green? Well, the medium speed route, right? Well, the main route is also, the high speed route is also a medium speed route, right? If you can do high speed, you can do medium speed too, right? And through the turnout is also a medium speed route. So this first block is clear, and so is the next block ahead, right? 2 blocks ahead are clear. That means we can show a green signal. Therefore, the middle must be green. And there is no low speed here, right? It wouldn't make sense really to have yellow over green over green. I guess you could. And in some scenarios, under different circumstances, railroads have done stuff like that. But what we want is the minimum amount of information to tell the engineer what he or she needs to know. So yellow over green is enough. The bottom head being red, it almost doesn't matter what it is, but it gives you more clarity. So does that make sense? It has to be yellow because the high-speed route's only clear for 1 block, but the middle head can be green because there are 2 medium-speed blocks that are clear ahead. And that tells the engineer a lot of information. It tells the engineer that they're diverging, presumably, or at least some medium speed is coming up, usually diverging, and that they don't have to stop at the next signal, which is really, really useful, right? You don't want to slow trains down unnecessarily. You don't want to spook the engineer in terms of like, well, I better stop. And, you know, he does something that, you know, slows the train down more than they need to or more quickly than they need to when they don't have to, right? So approach medium is probably the most telling signal that you can get in terms of understanding how the colors and the positions come together. Does that make sense? This is a good place to ask if there are any questions because this is where usually the eyes start glazing over and people's noodle starts getting baked. Does this make sense so far?
I think I'm following you, and I assume that if I'm following it, probably most of the people watching are following it too. Yeah, it makes sense, right? You're not having to slow all the way down because the switch or crossover will handle the speed that you're going to be at. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I got it. And maybe people have questions in the audience. Might be. Let's see. Sure. I'm looking for questions, and I don't really see anything asking for clarification here. So maybe we can do a green signal and proceed.
Right. We can upgrade it. Well, I'll say this before I move on. Imagine if this signal 10R was at stop. If it was all red, what would 2R be? 2R would have to be approach, right? It would have to be yellow over red, right?
Right, I was going to say yellow over red would be my guess because there's only 2 there.
Right. So it couldn't be approach medium because the medium speed route is only clear for one block, right?
Right.
So, you could argue, well, it should be yellow over yellow, but they use that for something else. I don't really cover it here, but there's a special scenario that really doesn't make any other sense except for yellow over yellow. But the point is, if let's say 2R was a single-headed signal, right, it would have to be approach. It couldn't be any better than approach no matter what. So because it's two heads, it would have to be yellow over red. That's basically the idea. And that's why, for example, if you're the engineer and you see this signal, if you see approach, you know the next signal is at stop. Whereas if you see approach medium, you know, okay, the next signal is something better than stop and good for at least medium speed, right?
Right.
So that's what I mean. It tells the engineer really a lot about what's going on ahead and gives them that time to react if they need to.
I have a comment that I'd like to make because there's someone in the chat that I'm perceiving as being ridiculously negative. Zeke M. This is strictly information. Not sure what you're complaining about. This is information about how railroads operate. You don't need any money to understand how railroads operate. Anyway, please continue, Mike. I just felt like I was compelled to comment about that because. Anyway.
Yeah, this is not a timeshare. You will not be forced to buy a signaling system for your model railroad. I assure you there's no obligation. There will be no flex steel for sale at the end of this clinic.
Yeah, here, hold on. I'll put something up that'll really make him cringe. Here we go.
What do you got? I can't see it. Oh, okay.
Yeah, please continue, sir.
All right. So here's another example of where we would use approach medium where we're not diverging, right? So here's a lineup for an eastbound train. We've got a stop here on the main, right, for whatever reason, and he doesn't have a westbound lined up. Whatever reason, he's going to stop this train here. 72R has to be at approach because the next signal is at red. What should signal 3598 be? Well, we could make it clear here if we wanted to because there are two clear blocks ahead. You'd get a clear and then an approach and then a stop. That would be fine. But what we typically do here, certain railroads would do, this is, I think, an example on the C&O, they would show approach medium here so that the engineer knows, okay, it's not clear like we're clear through the next town. This basically tells the engineer, hey, you're getting stopped at this next interlocking here, right, at signal 78. If this was clear, we wouldn't be sure because the next signal could be approach and 78 could be stop. By showing approach medium way back here, and this may be probably at least 4 miles ahead. Signal blocks are typically about 2 miles these days, maybe shorter, but point is further ahead, if we show approach medium here, the engineer knows, I got a red probably 2 blocks ahead, or at least I know I've got to get down to medium speed at the next signal, right? Maybe I'm diverging, maybe I'm stopping, but either way, something's going to happen here soon. So this is another good example of where you can use approach medium in a different context where you're not necessarily diverging, but where you say, okay, you may want to start slowing down now. And this is something that typically you'd see more in a speed signal railroad like the New York Central or the C&O or somebody like that. So approach slow, here's another similar example, right? We've got a crossover here that's good for slow speed. So we've got a slow clear here on 178. And ahead of here, right, we could show approach, right? But what that would tell the engineer is expect to stop at the next signal. By adding approach slow, we say, okay, you got to get down to slow speed, but you don't have to stop, right? This signal guarantees that you don't have to stop at the next signal, and that allows trains to move faster and allows the engineer to not have to slow down so much and have more information about what's coming, right? So this is approach slow. Again, it's approach, or I should say yellow on the top because the high-speed route is clear for 1 block. The medium-speed route, well, yes, it's clear for 1 here, or I guess, yeah, at least 1. So theoretically, you could argue, well, it should be yellow over yellow, and then the bottom can be green because the slow speed route is clear for 2. But again, for simplicity and clarity, it's a lot easier to see the yellow over red over green, right? So the green in the bottom head as opposed to the middle head for approach medium, right? And that brings us into medium approach, right? So now imagine a scenario where we have a medium speed crossover, but the track is only clear for 1 block ahead. Well, let's apply the rubric here. It can't be clear on the top or it can't be green on the top because the switch is lined against it. So it can't be green and it can't be yellow, right? The high-speed route is impassable at any speed. And the medium-speed route is clear, but it's only clear for 1 block. So this has to be yellow, right? It's lined up, but we've only got 1 block before we hit a red signal or some other impassable issue, and there is no low speed route here, so the bottom has to be red, right? So this is what we call medium approach. If you recall, approach was, and I'll go all the way back, approach is yellow on the top, medium approach is yellow in the middle. And as you might expect, yellow on the bottom would be slow approach, right? We've got a slow crossover and then one block clear. So for the same reasons, top head has to be red because the switch is against us. The medium speed route, there is no medium speed route, so it has to be red, right? And the low speed route is lined up, but it's only clear for one block, so it has to be yellow. Everybody with me so far? This is the part where I point out you now know the difference between approach medium and medium approach, right? Remember, approach medium is yellow over green, right? And this is the typical example. And then medium approach is yellow in the middle, right?
I think people's sort of predisposition to traffic signals on roads makes this confusing because the position of the signal doesn't really mean anything to us unless you're colorblind, in which case they have them set up so that you know which one is green. Mm-hmm. But yeah, just understanding that each signal means a different route is a big bonus here, I think, for most people.
That's a great point because, you know, on the highways, we need to account for the idea that, you know, the possibility that somebody might be colorblind. On the railroad, if you're colorblind, position matters and color matters. And if you can't see color, you can't be an engineer. You have to pass a vision test because it is critical. You know, the signal does need to communicate both status, which means basically how far you can go, you know, the colors, as well as route. If it's route signaling, you've got to know the route, right? Because clear on the top or a diverging clear might be two different speeds. And on a speed signaled railroad, it is by rule, literally, exactly, the word of God, the position implies the speed or requires the speed. So yes, that's a great distinction to make between highway signals. So slow approach, pretty straightforward. And that's about it as far as that goes. So let's talk about how we can use three heads to provide more than three speeds, right? Turns out the railroads need two more speeds, or at least one more. Restricted speed, and this is something we should slow down and make sure that we take time to really explain, because as somebody who's worked with both model railroaders as well as tourist railroaders and actual railroaders, this is a concept that is deceptively simple, but it has deadly consequences on the real railroad. And basically what restricted speed is, it's not any particular velocity. It's not 10 miles an hour or 20 miles an hour, although in the railroad rule books, there is a maximum speed at which you can operate at restricted speed. You can't do restricted speed at 70 miles an hour. Why is that? What restricted speed is, the words they use to describe it is a method of operation. And what that means is that you must be able to stop within half of your line of vision, short of any obstruction or a train. So let's imagine two trains coming at each other. And we're not going to do the arithmetic, one leaving from Chicago, Los Angeles, and figure out when they collide in Oklahoma. Imagine two trains are approaching each other. Well, if they can both stop within half of their line of vision, they'll never collide, right? If they can both see 100 feet and they can both stop within 50 feet, right? By definition, they'll never collide. And that's what restricted speed is. So this is a speed that you'll see, and sometimes you'll hear this called yard speed or that sort of thing. It's basically in a situation where two trains might approach each other and collide, either coming at each other or one following another, or where a switch might be lined against you, say in a yard or some other than main track, somewhere where there are no signals, right? So restricted speed basically means being able to stop within half your line of vision so that you don't hit anything that might come up. So basically the way I always explain it to my trainees on the railroad is if you hit something, it's your fault, basically. And the railroads will enforce that. So the point is, though, we want to stop two trains. The worst possible scenario would be two trains approaching each other at restricted speed. We want to make sure that they don't collide. And this is typically required, again, when you're off the main track. So if there are no signals and there's no other method of providing safety, like a track warrant or something like that, or in a yard, that's typically the maximum speed is restricted speed. And what most railroad rule books will say is not to exceed 15, or these days it's usually 20 miles an hour. And so you have to be able to stop within half your line of vision. That doesn't mean you can do 15 or 20. Restricted speed might be 1 mile an hour. right? If you're on a curve in, you know, some, I don't know, urban trackage somewhere with a grade crossing that's not protected, or you can't see for whatever reason, or maybe it's a grade, you need to be able to stop within half your line of vision, and that may be 5 miles an hour or 1 mile an hour. Might be very slow. You'll see this a lot on tourist railroads. You know, here in Sacramento, we have a tourist railroad in Folsom where there's a lot of blind curves, and the maximum speed on the line is 10 miles an hour to begin with. And there are places where, you know, 1 or 2 miles an hour is about as fast as you want to go if you're operating under restricted speed. So it's an important concept to understand for real railroaders, because you're dealing with big trains and people might die. For model railroaders, it really it applies to where the signal might otherwise be at stop, but where it could allow you to proceed at restricted speed to, say, follow a train ahead of you. Again, our goal is to keep trains moving. So restricted speed is a way that we can allow trains to keep moving, and we need a way to show that in our signal system. So I'll show you how we do it in just a minute, but the broad concept here is we need to show more than 3 speeds with 3 heads. How do we do that? Restricted speed is one of those speeds. One of the other speeds that I think the New York Central came up with was limited speed, which is somewhere between medium speed and maximum authorized speed. If you imagine their main track going to Chicago was probably good for at least 60 miles an hour, imagine a scenario where you've got to cross a train over from one track to another. If those crossovers are only good for 30 miles an hour, you've got to slow a train down from 60 miles an hour to 30 miles an hour, and then cross over and then re-accelerate that train to 60 miles an hour, or whatever the maximum authorized speed is. And that costs a lot of time, and that costs a lot of fuel. So what the Central and some other railroads did is they upgraded their main track crossovers to allow a higher speed, 45 miles an hour. Some of them now are 60 miles an hour. And so what that allowed the railroads to do was keep these trains moving at a higher speed, and they needed a way to show that speed on the signal system. So they called it limited speed because it's more than medium and less than maximum, right? So they called it limited, and we'll show in a minute how we can show those 2 different speeds with just 3 heads. So one of the solutions was to flash a light to upgrade a signal to a different speed, right? To make it better by flashing one or more, you know, one light typically. So for example, if we have a stop signal, it's all solid reds. If we want to upgrade that to restricted speed, we just flash one of the heads, right? So the little whiskers here indicate that the light is flashing. So if you're going, let's say, straight ahead on the main track, but there's a train ahead of you, you know, the signal might show, instead of stop, it'll show restricted, or restricting is usually the way that it's written. But that says basically proceed past this signal at restricted speed and expect a train ahead of you or a switch against you or some obstruction or something wrong, broken rail maybe even. But that flashing of the head takes what would otherwise be a stop signal and upgrades it to restricted. Right?
Yeah, this would be the confusing flashing red signals I talked about before, when I've seen flashing red out on the line, and I'm thinking, not knowing this, I'm thinking, oh, they're going to stop here. But at least I know something's coming. Well, then they just roll through. I'm like, hey, wait a minute, why didn't they stop? There's the answer.
Well, if you think about it, it's not all that different from the highway, because what's a solid red highway signal? Stop and stay, right? What's a flashing red signal? Stop and proceed. Right? It's a little bit better than stop. So it's almost the same concept, right? A yellow on a highway signal means basically it's going to turn red in a second, right? A time signal. Whereas a flashing yellow is, you know, approach with caution. You can go through, but maybe slow down, maybe pay attention. It's better than yellow. So it's kind of the same concept in the broad sense, but yeah, it's just a little bit different if you don't have that contextual, you know, cue on a railroad of like, no, this is better. This is better than stop. So yeah, here's a question. In the UK, when you've had a speed restriction, you cannot increase speed until the last car has left the restriction. Is that the same? That's a great question. So the answer is it depends. Generally speaking, yes. If the restriction is due to, say, track conditions, let's say a crossover, right? If you're going through a low-speed crossover, let's go back to our approach slow example, right? So let's say here, right, this crossover is only good for slow speed, let's say 15 miles an hour. Well, once we come through this signal, we've got to let the whole train go through there. We can't just let the engine go through and then accelerate and the rear of the train goes faster. That would be a violation of the speed limit, right? So in this scenario, or a similar scenario, yes, the entire train would need to pass it. But if it was, let's say, some reason you have to do restricted speed. Let's say there's, you know, some work gang where you have to approach them at restricted speed. But once the leading wheels of the engine get by, it doesn't matter how fast you go by. That's typically a scenario where you can approach at restricted speed, and then once the engine gets there, then you can resume speed. So it's a question of whether the track or the operating conditions allow the entire train to have to come, or require that the train slow down for whatever reason, or if it's just up to this point, once you get there, hey, after this, you don't need to be at restricted speed. The track is clear, you know, then you can resume speed as soon as the leading wheels reach that point. So that's a great question. That's a question that often comes up in rules classes for railroaders and tourist railroads and that sort of thing. The short answer is it depends why you're slowed down in the first place. So yeah, great question. So restricted speed, limited speed. One of the solutions is to flash the head, right? And this is typically used for stop to restricting, but we can also use it for approach, right? We can take an approach signal and flash the head, and some railroads use that to mean approach medium, right? So flashing yellow on the top is the same thing as yellow over green, right? If it's approach, it means that the next signal is red. If it's flashing yellow, it means, right, we have to understand that implies the next signal is something better than stop. Well, what's better than stop? Well, approach medium, or maybe slow approach, or excuse me, approach slow. But typically it's used for approach medium. What a lot of the railroads do now is it depends on the railroad. Some do one, some do the other. We'll see this in the rules a little bit later. But a lot of railroads use flashing yellow to mean advance approach, which means basically expect the next signal to be approach, right? But it depends on the railroad. It depends on the operating, you know, the shape of the railroad, you know, the topography of the railroad, and just preference by railroad. Some railroads use the same aspect to mean different indications, and we'll see that in the rules in just a little bit. But again, the point here is that we take an approach signal, which is a solid yellow, and we flash that yellow, and it upgrades it to something better, either approach medium or typically advanced approach. Same thing with approach medium. If we flash the green head on approach medium, the green head is the green signal on the middle head tells us that it's medium speed. If we flash that signal, it upgrades it to limited speed. And this is very, very common back on the Central, on the water level road, or the Chicago line. And this is what I saw a lot of in Rochester. So you'll have a scenario where, let's go back to the approach medium, right, scenario. Imagine if this signal was a limited clear, which would be this middle would be flashing. Well, then we could show approach limited back here, yellow over flashing green. And it basically tells the engineer, yeah, you're crossing over, but you only need to get down to limited speed, not medium speed. And again, the concept being that we flash the head, and that upgrades the signal from approach medium to approach limited. It allows you to go faster in this case, right? One of the other solutions, and this is what the Southern Pacific did, I don't want to say exclusively, but lunar white. So if we take a red signal, all red, and we make one of them lunar white, that upgrades it from stop, which means stop and stay here, to restricting, which allows you to pass that signal but at restricted speed. So what it says is typically you're going into a yard, or you're going off the main track, or somewhere where you're in unsignaled territory, and you can only proceed at restricted speed. And typically it's the bottom head, because again, it's sort of be the lowest route, lowest speed usually. But sometimes if there are multiple routes, let's say there's 2 entrances to a yard or something like that, they may show the lunar head in one of the other 2 positions to indicate the route as well. That's pretty rare. Usually it's just white on the bottom. That's about, you know, the least good signal that you can get better than stop, which is, you know, lunar on the bottom. But these would all be restricting, which allows you to pass it at restricted speed. Again, if it ain't all red, it ain't red at all. It allows us to move, allows us to proceed. And one of the other solutions, this isn't really a solution as much as an operating practice, but if you have a signal with a number plate on it, or in steep grade territory, a G, which stands for grade, you can stop and proceed. So imagine a single track railroad, and you've got a train ahead of you. Well, if you're following him in the same direction, you know, you can stop at that signal and then proceed at restricted speed and follow him and not collide with him, and that allows you to keep moving a little bit faster. You see this a lot in transit systems, they don't call it stop and proceed, but allows, like in the subway in New York, imagine a train that's in the station and there's a train waiting to enter behind them. If you have to wait for that train to exit the station and go a whole block ahead, that train behind would have to wait unnecessarily long. So what they allow is for the train to follow at a slow speed and approach into the station a little bit faster. And it doesn't sound like a lot, but a few seconds or minutes here and there add up to minutes and hours over the day and over many trains and so forth. So it allows trains to move a little bit more efficiently. So basically the number plate is usually the signal number. It's the milepost basically where it is. And that tells the engineer this signal is not absolute. It's a permissive signal. It allows me to stop and then proceed, even though it's at red, right? The rule will say if it's got a number plate on it, that's not stop, that's stop and proceed. And the rule usually reads something like, after stopping, proceed at restricted speed, to put it simply.
Sorry, Mike, would
Sure.
that have to do though with the engineer's ability to see whatever is up there? So like your subway example so the guy can come into the station, but if he sees the back of the other train, he's got to be going slow enough that he's not going to run it. I mean, it sounds like a stupid question as I'm saying it, but I'm trying to clarify it because I'm a little bit confused by this. You mentioned also something about if it's going into dark territory. Does the lunar white indicate that specifically, or is it like, because it seems like it could just be like a slow flashing red or whatever to go on the diverging route at a slow speed. I'm a little bit confused. Why would they use white again instead of a flash?
So there's a lot to unpack there, and these are great questions. Let's deal with Andy's question. It's the same question here. The lunar white doesn't indicate diverging. It indicates restricted speed, right? So lunar white also means restricted speed, just like flashing red means restricted speed. So we're saying the same thing, right? We're giving the same indication, proceed at restricted speed, but the aspect might be lunar white or it might be flashing red. So we can give the same indication with a different aspect, right? And that aspect in those cases doesn't mean diverging, it means proceed at restricted speed. Now, that being said, sometimes, this is pretty rare, but sometimes the position of the lunar or the position of the flashing red will indicate the route on top of that. So the bottom might be the yard, the middle might be, let's say, an unsignaled branch line, for example, right? And the top might be the main. So that if it was flashing on the top or lunar white on the top, it might be there's a train ahead, but you can proceed at restricted speed. If it's in the middle, it might be you're going down dark territory and it's either lunar white or flashing red, but that just means proceed at restricted speed, but you're not going down the main. And the bottom might be restricted speed because you're going into a yard, and it might be a lunar white or it might be a flashing red. Again, that's the key thing to understand here, is that we may show different indications. We may tell you to do the same thing, I should say, it's the same indication with different aspects. Does that answer the question as far as the lunar white and the flashing red?
I think it does. So really, it's an either or. Like it could be either flashing red or lunar white. They both mean exactly the same thing.
Right.
Depending where they are in the pole. Okay, I think that makes more sense. Okay.
Right, and that brings us to signal rules. You're about one slide too early with the question, but yeah, you're on the right track. Let me just also mention the grade signal thing too, which is kind of the same idea. Imagine somewhere like Mojave, right? You've got Tehachapi or Cajon Pass, or some hill area, some steep grade area where you've got trains going uphill at low speed following each other, some coal hauler, a C&O somewhere, right? You wouldn't want a big heavy coal train following another coal train's tail to have to stop and wait and then go and stop. So what a lot of those railroads decided was we can allow these trains to not even stop and proceed, but just keep going at restricted speed. You're probably going at a slow speed to begin with, right? Because you're going up grade and you're probably a heavy train, right? And it would be suboptimal to stop that train unnecessarily when they could just continue to proceed at restricted speed. So what the grade signal does, usually the G, is it makes it even better than stop and proceed. Remember, the number plate takes it from stop to stop and proceed. You've got to stop at the signal and then proceed at restricted speed. What the grade signal usually gives you is restricting. It says you can keep going at restricted speed because you're on a grade. It's really hard to have a runaway uphill. So it's real easy for a train that might be following somebody else to stop short of something. So even if you're heavy and it's a mountain grade, if you're going uphill, the railroads figured out that it was more efficient and perfectly safe to allow them to continue following at restricted speed without stopping. So again, our goal is to keep trains moving, and these two things allow trains to keep moving when they otherwise would have to stop or unnecessarily slow down.
You know what this reminds me of, Mike, is sometimes when you're near the entrance to a big yard, you'll see half a dozen trains, because you can see the lights, right, off in the distance, but they're not all stopped, at least not always. They're usually rolling very slowly and getting the correct routing into whatever track, the yard. I guess it's the yard dispatcher, the yard master.
The herder,
it might even be the dispatcher. And well, in the case of UP, wherever they are in Omaha or whatever, telling them, lining the switch, but saying, go slow enough to where we can get that other train into the right place and then reset the switch. I'm sure that they stop at the red signal if it's red going into if it's a solid red going into the yard while the guy's getting the switches prepared. But I have noticed that a lot of times, I always think of it like a runway, and there are a bunch of planes coming, because when you're at an airport, you can see all the planes at night. You can see all the planes' lights coming in, and they're lined up one after another after another. It always feels like that when these trains are coming to these big yards. And maybe it's just a perception of mine, but I'm under the impression that they're all rolling real slow just until they get to the point where they have to stop in case the guy gets backed up and can't keep up with the amount of traffic going through.
Sort of. It depends. Basically, the dispatcher is only concerned with the main track. Once you line a train off the main track, or what they call other than main track, that might be a yard, that might be an unsignaled branch line, something like that. The dispatcher is no longer concerned with that. So it's not sort of a continuous roll as much as the dispatcher has authorized the train to pass a signal or not. That's all the dispatcher can do is, the gate is open or the gate is closed. The signal system itself, once the dispatcher says, okay, allow a train to pass here, the signal system itself determines what the aspect or, what the signal will show based on conditions. All the dispatcher does is allow a signal to show something better than stop, right? The signal system then, and then in combination with the rules, of course, and this is touching on Andy's question here about, why don't we just have one aspect per meeting? Well, because there are reasons. Because, in the case of the SP, they like to use the lunar generally to mean that you're going off the main track into a yard. Whereas if there's a train ahead on the main track, they would typically use a flashing red. So it's tough for us as, I'll call us civilians, as non-professional railroaders who don't have the experience of the context of where these signals would be used to understand the little nuances. Well, why did they do this? Why did they do that? And I can talk about all that today, but there's so many different examples and so many different scenarios that my focus here is to get the concept of the lights and the positions. The three colors and the three positions is the key concept to understand. And then we can, if you want, go into detail more on that. But what I want to focus on is the big concepts, and then we can drill down. And we'll do that a little bit here in a minute when we get into ABS and CTC about, well, why did they use flashing red here and why did they use lunar here? But to answer your question, Andy, I think it was, the lunar typically meant you were going into a yard or off the main track. Whereas if you were following a train down the main or say into a siding, they would use the flashing red there. And the difference would tell the engineer, okay, you're going into the yard versus where you're going. Or certain cases, you can only get a flashing red here and you can only get lunar there. It's not like everything's always lunar or always this. It depends on where you are and what the context is. And that's what the signal rules are all about. Believe me, the railroads didn't want the signals rules to be any more complicated than they had to be. The whole idea was to make it as simple as possible so that the engineers could focus on handling the train. You want to give that engineer, okay, what do I do here and what do I do at the next signal? That's basically what a signal tells you. How fast can I pass this signal and how far ahead am I clear, or what do I do at the next signal? It's kind of the same idea. The real complaint you should have is, why do we name them the way that we do? Why is it approach medium and medium approach? And I don't have this part prepared in my head very well, but basically when you say approach, it means approach the next signal prepared to stop, right? When we say approach medium, we mean approach the next signal prepared to pass it at medium speed, right? Stop is stop and stay, right? Slow approach means approach the next signal prepared to pass at slow speed. In Canada, they're a little more sort of, what do I do here? What do I do after as the name of the signal? In America, we're all about, short to the point and slang, right? And so it's really, if you want to dig into it, it's really a cultural thing about Americans, we call it the shortest thing we possibly can so that it's quick and to the point.
So are you saying, Mike, that in the Canada, the Canadian signal say, sorry, but you have to stop at the next signal?
Sorry, there's a train ahead. You might want to stop, okay? So go ahead and stop.
Thank you.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Yeah, they're definitely a more verbose and probably polite people. Yeah, it comes through in the signaling systems. But we'll talk about that a little bit later on in just a minute here about the difference between different railroads, not only in this country, but there are some questions about the UK and worldwide. And, all railroads have the same problem, right, is allowing trains to move as fast as possible without any risk to safety. And we all approach it a little bit differently. But out here in America, the railroads really, the physical characteristics of their railroads and the amount of money that they had, I think, are the two primary factors that influence the complexity of their rules. So why don't we just roll right into that? Let's look at the difference between the Southern Pacific rules here, and I think these are 1996 rules. These are at the end. And on the right, we have the Western Pacific rules that were in effect, I think, in '83 at the end. The thing that you'll notice immediately is that the Western Pacific rules are a lot simpler. There are a lot less of them, right? So over here, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 distinct rules, right? On the SP, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 different rules. And we also notice for each rule, there are multiple different aspects. So for clear, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 different possible aspects. The WP had one. One head is green, that's clear. And the reason for that is the WP didn't have a whole lot of money, and their railroad was a lot simpler. Their railroad was mostly single track across the middle of the desert with passing sidings every so often. And they didn't have a huge terminal like, the SP might have had, in LA, or like the New York Central in New York. Their rule book is similarly complex. Their railroad was just a lot simpler, and they had no money. So they wanted to minimize the number of heads, right? So the maximum number of heads that you'll see on any Western Pacific signal is 2. Whereas on the Southern Pacific, you'll see 3. The New York Central, you'll see 3. In some cases on the WP, there are 4-headed signals in some places. But even the SP here, you can see, is a little complicated. They've got some semaphores, right? Some old semaphores from probably the Siskiyou line or out in New Mexico, right? On the Tucumcari line. They also apparently have some color position lights. I don't know where that would have come from in the SP, but you've got to account for all of that in your rule book. So a railroad like the SP, or specifically the UP, is the greatest example. They've inherited and bought out and merged with so many railroads that they have their signaling system and the SP signaling system, and and CSX has this. They have the color position light signals from the B&O, and they've got the New York Central searchlight signals and all that. So the signal rules really tell you a lot about the railroad if you don't already know. And if you do already know, then you understand why the signal rules are as complicated as they are. But the thing to take away here also is that those concepts of the 3 colors and 3 positions, right, still apply. So green on the top is proceed. Green on the top is proceed, or clear, right? That's the same thing. The name is clear. The indication is proceed, right? But it's still green on top. Green on the top is always clear. Now, here's a good example of just preference, right? On the WP, they flash the yellow to mean approach medium, right? Whereas on the SP, that was advance approach. And we'll see in a minute sort of the examples of that in context of where you would use that. But, approach medium, proceed approaching next signal at medium speed. It basically told you were going to cross over at the next signal. Whereas on the SP, that told you the next signal's at approach, and say not at stop. It's better than approach, right? This signal, flashing the yellow, makes it better than approach to tell you that the next signal is approach. And what that does is it gives you, the engineer, more time. Ask yourself another broad question. Why would we need advanced approach, right? Well, imagine the New York Central and their limited speed, right? Well, they got trains running 100 miles an hour out there, right? You can't have a 100-mile-an-hour train see an approach signal and then in 2 miles have to stop. right? You're not stopping in 2 miles at 100 miles an hour. So they needed that extra block to give that train enough time to stop under the worst possible scenario, which would be 3 blocks ahead as a stop. So on the New York Central, they needed advanced approach as soon as they added, high-speed trains and all of that. So whereas the WP, they didn't have any 100-mile-an-hour trains, I don't think. I think their maximum authorized speed was probably 70 miles an hour somewhere in the desert, right? I'm not an expert on that off the top of my head, but that tells you a lot about the railroad, right? Same thing here, diverging clear, right? You can see the WP used sort of, route signaling here. Red over green isn't medium clear, it's diverging clear. Proceed on diverging route, observe prescribed speed through turnout. In other words, the engineer needed to know the speed of that particular turnout. Most of them were the same, so you knew, okay, most of the time you get a diverging clear, it's good for 30 or whatever. Maybe some were good for 40 or whatever as they upgraded stuff, but the point is the engineer had to know, whereas red over green, the same thing on the SP with route signaling, but on the New York Central, this would be a medium clear, and the rule would read, proceed not exceeding medium speed. Doesn't even say that you're diverging, because if you're doing the speed, we don't care whether we're diverging or not, right? And that's, again, the difference between route signaling and speed signaling is if all you care about is speed, then you don't have to care about diverging route. But if you need people to know what the speeds are, then they need to know whether they're diverging or not. But here's that double yellow, right? Yellow over yellow is advanced approach, whereas the SP and most railroads like to flash the yellow. Although East Coast did this too, the CNO did advanced approach. Remember we saw that way back here, right? Where is it? So here, slow clear, right? On the CNO, this would be approach slow. Same aspect, different indication, right? So the key takeaway here for both rail fans and model railroaders is, look at what your railroad did and look at their practices and their signal rules to know what the right aspect to show is under a given scenario. And again, that is based on the physical characteristics and just operating preferences. So here's another good example. Restricting on the WP was flashing red. So, okay, same thing on the SP, right? We have flashing red here. But the SP liked lunar for whatever reason. It was probably easier to see in terms of discerning the color, and it was probably cheaper than a flasher, right? A lot of these signals, the bottom head was only a lunar white. In other words, it could only show lunar, and that was probably cheaper than having electronic hardware, relays and whatnot to flash the head. So that was probably a cost-saving thing. But same thing with the WP, right? Rather than adding a second head, they just flash the red head. Same thing for diverging restricting, right, versus diverging approach is whether the yellow is flashing. Well, you say, okay, well, red over yellow, right? Shouldn't that be like a approach medium or a medium approach, right? Yeah, I guess they would have called it diverging approach, right? Where is it? So diverging approach here, right? But on the WP, it was restricting, and the reason for that was most of their sidings were not signaled. So when you went into a siding, you had to go in at restricted speed. And of course, later on, if they added a siding that was controlled and did have signals on it, what's the easiest thing to do? Just flash the yellow to say, okay, you don't have to go at restricted speed. You can now go on approach and expect the next signal to be red, but you don't have to expect a train or a broken rail or a switch against you, right? So in the WP's case, again, rather than adding heads, they like to flash things. So generally speaking, they try to use one head whenever possible. And that gets you about half of the rule book. And then when you have diverging, you necessarily need two heads. So you'd always need two heads there. But for other places where you had one head, you could just flash it and not have to add a second head, which saved them a ton of money. And so again, you look at the railroad signals, you can learn about how big their budget was by how big their signal rules are. Generally, the more signal rules they had, the more money they had, I would say. So a good example here on the WP. NORAC, Conrail, Central used to like this too, because a lot of times there'd be a dwarf signal with a red over yellow. They don't really make the distinction on the SP, but on the New York Central, red over yellow on a tall mast would be a medium approach, whereas red over yellow on a dwarf signal would be restricting. So sometimes the size of the signal would matter. I don't have an example of that, I think, on these rules. But again, know your railroad, know your cut of meat, know what your railroad did and why, and it will make a lot more sense. Again, here on the SP, we've got semaphores. The WP, I don't know that they ever had them. But even if they did, these same rules would essentially apply for the single heads. The WP, or excuse me, the SP had a lot of older semaphores on lines like the Siskiyou line that survived, into the 80s and 90s in some cases. It was at Raton. There's still signals out there on the Amtrak has to run, or semaphores, I mean. So, we can see on some of these, and I could do a whole piece on these semaphores. You go, well, how is red over yellow? Hang on just one second. My headphones have cut out here. I've got to wake my headphones up again. How is, red over yellow, green over green? How does that make sense in this context? It doesn't. Don't even think about it. It's a whole other thing. Basically, what these were the top signal, or the top semaphore arm would tell you the next block ahead, meaning the immediate block ahead, which would either be green if it was clear, or red if it was occupied. And the bottom would either show green or yellow if the next signal ahead was better than stop. So if the next signal ahead was something better than stop, the bottom head would show green, or the bottom arm. And if it was at stop, right, the bottom would show yellow. So that's why stop and proceed is red over yellow. The next block is occupied, but you can proceed at restricted speed after stopping. And presumably the signal ahead of that will be at red, right? So the bottom arm has to be at yellow. But for approach, right, meaning the next block is clear, but the next signal is red, well, that's what the top tells us. Tells us the next block is clear, and the bottom tells us the signal ahead of that is at something that is at stop, essentially. And then for the clear scenario, where the next two blocks are clear, we get green on top because the block immediately ahead is clear, and then the signal ahead of that is showing something better than stop. So side note on that, you can do your own homework on that, but this is why the signal rules, back to the question about, well, why don't we just have one aspect per indication? Because on the SP, you might be on part of the system where they have searchlights like this, where clear is a green searchlight, and you might be on the Siskiyou line where they have semaphores. So you need to understand that you can get a clear indication with different aspects depending on where you are, right? Same thing with the color position lights. I could do a whole clinic on color position lights. They're a little bit more complicated, but the same essential concept apply, right? So is that a good stop point here? Any other questions on that?
Do you know what's becoming clear to me? I know that railroaders have to have a copy of the rule book with them at all times, and I understand why now, because I'd never remember all that stuff.
Yeah. Well, the truth is that thanks, Dave. Thank you very much. On behalf of John, it doesn't come to me, for the record. But
I'll buy you a beer when I see you.
Sure. Okay. Let's get something clear. I saw what you did there. No, you do need to reference this stuff, but it's not like you're busting out the signal rules, as you're going down the line, looking in the cab, like, oh, there it is. Let me look that up. You get it from context. And this is why when you qualify as a railroader, you have to pass a signal rules exam, because you have to be able to know it. It's, imagine driving your car. It's like, oh, yellow. Let me go look that up in the driver's handbook. Like, you have to know immediately when you see it what to do. And that comes from preparation and study, and from context and experience. If you ask me to draw this signal rules diagram from memory, I might be able to do it because I'm a student of it, but most railroaders probably couldn't do that. But when they see the signal, they know what to do, because, okay, whenever I'm here, I either get a clear or I get an approach medium if this is happening, or a stop, or whatever. It's not an infinite number of possibilities at any signal. Not every signal can show every aspect, right? So there's only certain aspects that apply. And for example, when you're out on single track, there are only single heads. So there's only three possibilities. It's green, it's yellow, or it's red. Most people can remember three things, right? Everything else beyond that, you get used to seeing yellow over green. Eventually, you just sort of memorize it. But a key point I would make here: a lot of let me put this politely, lazy railroaders might say something like, "Oh, it's too complicated. You just got to memorize everything." And for some people, that might be an easier way to think about it and to apply the rules. But the whole point of this clinic is to express the principles behind why these are what they are, so that even if you don't know what it is, you can figure it out. You can apply those principles and understand it. And that's why it's called Understanding Railroad Signals. I could come in here and say, here are the rules, memorize them, and here's a great way to memorize it. But I don't think that's a great way to learn. I think if you understand why things are the way they are, it's a lot easier to remember what they are and why they're the way they are.
You make a good point, I think, that it's better to know how to think than what to think.
Exactly.
And,
rules for life.
Right? Well, I guess it depends. Yeah. I think it also drives home the idea about being familiar with the line that you run on, whether that's through being qualified to run on it or whatever. The point is, you know what to expect and you know what it means when you get there because you've done this 100 times or 1,000 times.
Right.
So,
right. Exactly. So I got a question about Union Pacific signals here. So, or about big railroads that are consolidated. Let me see if I can find real quickly in 1 second or less Union Pacific rules, because they probably have the most complicated rule book. There's NORAC. I'm just Googling here real quick. I'm sorry, I wasn't prepared for this. I have it somewhere probably, but
what? I thought you were a professional. What is this?
I'm fired. I'm fired. So fired.
Yeah, we're going to cut your pay for this now.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well,
I was going to give you overtime, but now it's going to be cut.
The commutative property of, division by 0 is okay. Yeah. So let me see if I can just pull this up real quick.
We may have to stop sharing the one.
Yeah. Let me just got too many windows going on here. So let me come back here and share this window. Well, actually, I can just share my whole screen. I'll just do it that way. So here is the Union Pacific rules, and this is a pretty simplified version. But same kind of thing, stop and proceed, right? They have a flashing stop and proceed, restricting. So here's our lunars, right? Diverging approach slow. What this doesn't have is all the SP stuff on it. This has got to be from before the merger or something. I can't see exactly when it was. Let's hide that. 2010. Well, I don't know, but this doesn't show what I wanted to show in terms of complexity, but you can see how many different aspects there are for each rule, right? Approach limited, all the flashing. Approach medium, you can see yellow over yellow is how they like to do it. Diverging clear limited. This is what the New York Central would have called limited clear, as opposed to diverging clear. They had to call it something different, right? Diverging clear slow, right? Kind of interesting. Proceed on diverging route. Here, let me zoom in a little bit. Proceed on diverging route. Speed through turnout must not exceed 15 miles an hour. Diverging approach limited, right? You can stop. Speed passing not next signal must not exceed 40. In other words, you can fly through here, but you got to go through the next signal at no more than 40. So yeah, the question was about lots of different signal situations, right? Sorry. And I need to show this. This is a good example of it, where you've got searchlight signals, because that's what the SP had. They also had semaphores in the early days that carried on. And I'm not sure why they have CPLs. I'm trying to think, were there CPLs like on the it must have been the Tucumcari line or somewhere, something they inherited somewhere. I can't imagine anywhere they used that west of the Mississippi. But the point is exactly that. A railroad that merges with other railroads will typically inherit and integrate the mergees into their signal system. In other words, their signal rules will get combined. And the real trouble you get into with this is not so much memorizing it, but conflicting principles. There was, I think it was the C&O did something funny. I don't remember the example off the top of my head, but they did something like this, where red over yellow was restricting and flashing was something else. And basically, once they made a certain change, then they had to do everything else sort of a funny way. And then when they got merged into CSX, you had basically two signals that had conflicting indications. And so they had to basically throw it out and sort of fix the railroad, or like the rules on this division are this, and then the same signal, the same aspect is a different indication depending on where you are in the system. And that is the nightmare, where depending on where you are. But the other side of it is it tends to be division wide, and you're usually, if you work for the railroad, you're in one division or you're in the other. It's not like you work these rules and you work those rules. That's
right. I was going to mention that. I think that generally speaking, that people that work for the railroad tend to work in one area, so they wouldn't necessarily have to know everything about that. I'll let you get caught up there.
Yeah, no, sorry.
That's fine. They don't have to know every single rule in the book because they aren't going to have to run on some of these places where the other rules apply, right? So it's probably not as hard to conceptualize or comprehend as it seems just by looking at all these different pictures on the page there. So I think that's something to consider.
No, definitely. It's one of those things, you don't know what you don't know. You know, as model railroaders, I'm a model railroader. That's really where I started. I mean, like I said, I grew up riding the subway in New York. And let me just point out, the signals in the New York City subway work, I don't want to say completely differently, but there's a whole other concept to that. And if you're really interested in that, there's a great page. Let me think. I think it's nycsubway.org. They have a really great guide. I don't know if we put it in the chat here or something like that. I don't know if there's any New Yorkers in here, but you know, I found it very. Here, I'll shoot it in the private chat. I don't know if you can share it or whatever. But as a New Yorker, growing up as a kid, I was sort of baffled by how it worked. A lot of it used the sort of different head for different route principles. But again, between the three different subway systems before it was merged into what's now the MTA, the New York City subway, you had the IND, you had the BMT, and the IRT, and they all used similar but slightly different signal, I'll say, approaches, no pun intended. They approached how to display information in different ways. And then there's some different special stuff for subways that's kind of cool, like what they call station time, which basically allows a train to approach a train ahead in the station at slow speed and then follow very closely, which allowed trains to run faster, which, again, seconds count when you're dealing with a subway system where a train is coming every minute. You know, on the Western Pacific in the middle of the desert, you might have a train every hour. You know, at Lexington Avenue and 42nd Street on the Lex line, you're going to get a train every 30 seconds, you know. So little bits that they could do to optimize, you know, trains being able to proceed and, of course, safely mattered. So if you're in the New York City subway, you know, check that link out and, you know, reach out. I'd love to chat about it, but go read through all that stuff first, because it's sort of, it's really complicated, but it's amazing what they were able to achieve with century-old technology. It's basically relays and timers. And, you know, there's a little arm that'll come up. If there's a stop signal, it will dump the brakes on the train if you go past it. And it was really amazing the efficiency that they were able to achieve, and the number of trains, how fast and how closely they could follow with, you know, it's technology from a century ago. Very simple electronics, really. And then the complexity of remembering all the rules. I think that's probably the most complex signal rule book I can think of. They've simplified it a great deal over the last couple of decades. But if you really want to geek out on signals, that's, I think, where you want to go. Here's a question from Mr. Hammer. What signal system will KCS use once they merge with the CN? Well, I could make a joke about whether that merger is actually going to happen, but we'll find out. You know, I'm not an expert on KCS or CN, but I would imagine that initially they will probably not change anything. They will probably allow the Kansas City Southern to keep running their rules. Because keep in mind, you can't just change signal rules. You have to change the hardware in the field to observe and behave according to those rules. And that is, I mean, at the very simplest level, a costly endeavor, right? Railroads don't want to spend money if they don't have to. So I would imagine they probably won't make any changes at all, at least initially, if ever, right? It doesn't make sense unless you're sort of, you know, doing a signal upgrade anyway. So for example, like on the, I don't know, let's say the UP buys the SP, right, or merges, whatever, and they're going to get rid of the semaphores anyway. Well, they're not going to put in the SP rules. They're going to put in whatever the best practice of the time is. So I imagine what they will do is they will leave it alone until it's time to upgrade signals and replace them. And that's when they will make them match whatever the CN does now on their typical lines.
Which makes sense because it's a costly endeavor. And look at UP now. Even now, they have SP signals all over the place because they just haven't done anything with it yet, which is why the damn rule book is so complex.
That's right.
You know,
it's a lot easier. Anyway. It's a lot easier to make the crews work harder than it is to pay people to upgrade signals. You're talking millions and millions of dollars versus, hey guys, remember a couple of different aspects. It's not that big of a deal. And keep in mind, you know, one of the other sayings I'm really fond of is the railroad never changes. It's just the name on the check, right? It's the same track, it's the same engines, it's the same railroad, right? Same signals, same guys running it. So it's really a question of, well, you know, does everybody else on the UP need to know it? And that's when it gets into the intricacies of how they break down their signal rules by division or system-wide or what have you.
Yeah, that kind of goes to what I was talking about earlier, where, and in this case, you're talking about CN taking over KCS if it happens. I don't think it will either, but say they do.
Yeah.
Probably the same guys that work at KCS now will still work at KCS, and they already know the rules. Why would they change anything? It would just confuse people and be expensive. So
yeah. So you know, rail fans love to think about that, but at the end of the day, you know, it just doesn't make sense, you know. And they may not even officially merge the railroad. I mean, typically they like to paint everything up to match and all of that. You know, then you'll start seeing motive power. But at the end of the day, it's the same railroad, it's the same signals and the same physical characteristics. So sometimes literally they don't even, you know, it's still the Kansas City Southern Railroad. It's just now owned by CN. You know, you see this with the regional guys like, you know, Buffalo and Pittsburgh and, you know, the Rail America, that type of outfit where, you know, they've got a mishmash of different railroads and different signaling systems, and they essentially keep the railroads distinct as operating companies. They just, you know, use a common family paint scheme at the end of the day, and of course they own it. Yeah, they're not gonna throw out millions of dollars worth of hardware just to make it easier on railroaders. That's the last thing they're gonna do. That's the last thing they spend money on, is making your job easier in general. They're generally oriented to making money, saving cost, and saving complexity. And if that makes it easier, so be it. But you know, it really boils down to having less relays in the cabinet, not less rules in the book.
Yeah.
So,
we're kind of going off in the weeds here, aren't we? But
well, no, these are great questions.
Yeah, maybe take that one, and then we can continue on.
Okay, yeah, this is another great question. So does the dispatcher need to know the signal indications? No, the dispatcher doesn't. And in fact, you wouldn't want the dispatcher to do that. In fact, I think they're prohibited by rule from saying that. You know, if an engine calls up and said, you know, what does that signal say? The dispatcher says, I can't tell you. You know, view what the signal says. Because, I mean, to answer the question, again, basically all the dispatcher does at the most basic level is say, a train can pass this signal, right? And nowadays, it's not so much each individual signal. Usually they use what's called an entrance and exit approach, where you say, okay, from here to here, clear the route, right? And that's generally called an NX type system, entry and exit, N for entry, X for exit. And so it depends on the system. You know, the earliest mechanical systems were, you know, CTC machines. We call them lever machines. And this is what we have at the Sacramento Model Railroad Historical Society. Let me see if I can pull up a picture real quick. This is going to be horrendous, but let me just show you that. Let me jump back in here and I will share that window.
Maybe hey Mike, while you're finding that, this is actually, I think, a good question that Dave is asking. What if you come upon a dark signal and you know it's supposed to be lit up? I think the logical answer would be you better stop and call the dispatcher and get whatever orders you need, right? What would they do?
That's right. So let's answer that one quick. It's just like when a traffic light goes out on the highway. If the signal is out, what you have to do is assume it's displaying its most restrictive indication, which is typically stop, right? On a highway, it's stop. You have to assume it's a red light if it's out, right? Because if they're all out, you know, you can't go, right? We all have to stop. We have to treat it like a stop sign. So the rules on the railroad are the same thing. The rule book will read something like, if the signal is displaying an incorrect or improper indication, assume it's displaying its most restrictive indication, which is typically either stop or stop and proceed. So yeah, if it's dark or if it's displaying something that is not a valid aspect, it's not in the book, you have to treat it as usually stop. Yeah. So can everybody see the picture here of the green machine here? I can't see you, John, so I think you can see it here.
I can see this. Yeah, it's a CTC machine.
So this is what the dispatcher would have had in the 1930s. Union Switch and Signal pretty much pioneered this, and I think GRS came out with a similar thing shortly after. And basically there's what we call the model board at the top. This is kind of a schematic of the layout or the railroad. So the white lines are the tracks, and the one in the middle here is the main, and you can see there's like a little siding here, and these little red dots would be lights, and if there was a train in the block, that light would be lit up. And basically each one of these switch columns corresponds to a switch or a turnout on the railroad. So this might be a siding here, for example. And one of these levers controls the switch, and the other lever controls which direction is cleared for movement. So let's say you wanted a train here on this section to go straight through. You would line the switch for normal. You would line the signal to the left, and you would push the button, and it would clear the signal and line the switch for straight ahead. Similarly, if you wanted to line them into the siding, you would reverse the switch lever, you would push the signal lever to the left, and you'd push the button, and the switch would line for the siding, and then the signal would clear, and it would show the appropriate indication. So, or aspect, I should say. So to answer the question, no, the dispatcher is concerned with routing. In other words, where is this train going to go? The signal system then determines, based on the conditions, what aspect to show in the field. So the dispatcher doesn't know. This is what dispatchers used from about the 1930s to about the 70s or 80s when the computer systems came around, the Digicon and other systems came around. And basically they would have a computer screen that shows this, and the dispatcher would say, click on this side and then click way down here, and it would line up all the signals in one shot. But in either case, the dispatcher doesn't know or care what the aspect is. All the dispatcher cares about is, I've authorized the train to proceed from here to here. And the signal system does the rest. That provides safety, and it also provides sanity for the dispatcher. Imagine if the dispatcher had to go, okay, well, this guy's here, and then it's approach medium, so I got to make this head that. It would be impractical, right? There's no way the dispatcher would be able to keep up. As somebody who dispatches model railroads using a machine like this CTC machine that I just had up, you know, just keeping up with the train's enough. Just authorizing movements and keeping track of where everything is and writing down on the train sheet where everybody is enough to keep you busy. So I can tell you from firsthand experience it would be impractical. But aside from being unpractical, it would be unsafe, right? You'd be relying on the dispatcher, their human judgment, you know, after being awake for 12 hours, day after day after day, it would be unsafe. So that's the whole point of the signal system, is to allow the dispatcher to command and control traffic, right, without having to worry about the safety. What we call the vital logic in the field is what provides that. Even if the dispatcher tries to provide, to clear an unsafe route, the signal won't let you. The machine won't actually issue the command if it's obviously dumb, right? If you put two trains at each other, it won't even let you do it. But there are scenarios where, for example, you clear a train and let's say a train runs a red signal. Well, what would happen? All the signals ahead of it would have to go to stop, right? All the signal system knows is this block is occupied. It doesn't care why, but that's a scenario where you could have two trains running at each other. And there's a great video on YouTube of this. I'm sure you fans have seen it. There's a BNSF train and he's approaching a siding. There's a train on the main track past the switch. And as the train approaches, what that train sees is the signal goes from, I think it would have been probably a diverging approach, red over yellow, to red over red. And what the engineer knows immediately is that that train coming at him has passed the red signal, and he jumps out of the cab and the trains collide. That's a perfect example of where you would see, well, what happens if something goes wrong? That's what happens. And that's about the worst case scenario. Now imagine if they were, and we're going to talk about this in just a second, but if they were on a big long stretch of single track with many blocks in between them, if a train ran one of those blocks, right, the trains would be protected as they approached each other, right? You would see the signals turn and whatever. And now obviously, you know, they don't stop the trains. On the subway system, they will physically enforce that. They'll dump the air if you go by a stop signal. But most railroad signals, until we've got PTC now, they didn't enforce anything. They just advised the engineer. Now, the Santa Fe had automatic train stop. The New York Central had automatic train stop. Some railroads, the big, rich, long railroads, had the money and the justification to install safety systems that if you passed a red signal, it would apply the brakes. It would be a penalty brake application. But for most route signal railroads, they didn't have that. So, you know, keep in mind, what keeps you safe is the engineer's judgment of those signals, not, you know, any physical enforcement. But for example, in the subway system, you can't have that. You cannot allow an unsafe condition to occur no matter what. And that's the ultimate goal of signals at the end of the day. Obviously, safety is more important than efficiency, but we need both, right? One without the other is no good. We can be fast and unsafe, that's unacceptable. And we can be safe and slow, that's practically unacceptable too. So those are the two things we need to do. And that's what the signal system does, is it separates the command and control from providing the safety, which cannot be compromised under any circumstances, right? Good questions, guys. These are great questions. But I think in the interest of time, we should probably move on a little bit. I knew we were going to take it slow. I didn't think it'd be this slow, but
I'm going to give you a high green right here.
All right, Roger, here we go. Track speed. All
Okay,
right, so you see my slides again now?
Sure can.
Okay, so let's get into the more conceptual stuff. We're mostly done here. This stuff's going to be relatively easy by comparison. So let's talk about the different systems. This is how the signals actually work in the broader context of the entire region or area of track that we're talking about. So the first signal systems really that came out were automatic block signals. These were really simple. This was the first set of signaling systems that weren't manual block. We had manual block and towers and things before that, but automatic block signals basically keep trains separated. They keep trains from colliding with each other by dividing the main track up into blocks or sections that are protected by signals that monitor occupancy and switch positions. So basically, if the track ahead is clear and the switches are all lined up, it will show green. Right? If there is a train ahead, 2 blocks ahead, it'll show yellow. And if there's a train in the block ahead of you or there's a switch open, it will show red. And otherwise, the signals will display proceed or clear if everything's lined up and no train is there. But an important thing to understand is that they don't give the train the authority to occupy the main track. You still need a train order or a track warrant or verbal authority, some kind of separate permission to occupy the track. All the ABS tells you is what the status of the track is ahead. It doesn't allow you to occupy the track. And the reason I make that point is because when we get into CTC later on, we'll learn that those signals actually provide authority and why that's important. But for ABS, it just tells you what's going on. It doesn't say whether you should proceed. It just says whether you, or I shouldn't say, it doesn't say whether you can, it says whether you should, right? And the signals are permissive. Remember we talked about absolute versus permissive. In an ABS system, the most restrictive indication is either restricting or stop and proceed. Because typically ABS is on single track where you can proceed if you stop, but you don't necessarily have to stop because as we'll see in a moment, there are scenarios where you can actually approach, 2 trains can approach each other at restricted speed. But let's start with the most simple example of ABS, which is double track ABS. This is what most railroads did in the early days. The first thing they would do, of course, is you build the track, right? You're going west from, Chicago to California, whatever. You build the first track. There's no signals. There's no nothing. Everything is using timetable and train order for control, which is a whole other clinic. And I'm a geek about that too, if you want to talk about that. But that's for another day. And then typically as traffic would increase, they would add a second track. And it would run, typically the first track would be westward, and the second track would be for eastward movements. So that's what we see here. We see 2 tracks, and they're signaled only in one direction. So on the top track, let's call it track number 1, trains only go to the left or westbound. And on the bottom track, track number 2, trains only go to the right or eastbound. And if trains only go in one direction, we only need the signals to go in one direction. And it turns out this makes it pretty easy and pretty simple for ABS to work. So you can see these signals are clear because all the blocks ahead are clear and there are no switches. But let's say there was a little spur in this block. If this switch was open or reversed, this signal behind it would have to show red, right? But notice it's got a number plate on it. If we remember, the number plate means this is not stop and stay, this is stop and proceed. So if a train were to approach this, they would see a yellow, right, an approach, and then they would see stop and proceed. So after stopping, they would slowly proceed into this block, prepared to stop ahead of this switch. And why is this switch open? Well, probably there's a train working here, most likely. But if for whatever reason this switch was left open, that train would approach that switch and presumably line it back up and then proceed, continuing at restricted speed until they get to this clear signal, which they would resume. Similar scenario down here. There's a train ahead. Train behind them is at stop and proceed. But traffic only goes in one direction. So if this train were to come up behind him, right, he would see this approach and then he would see this stop and proceed. And well, he could sit here and stop till this train gets past this signal. But why? He could just follow him at restricted speed. This train can't back up, right? By rule, we're saying that everything on this track goes this way, right? And so that's why these signals are stop and proceed and not stop. And what a lot of railroads have done now is even made this better, where if you have this signal that has a number plate on it, they upgrade it from stop and proceed to restricting where you can proceed at restricted speed without stopping. And so imagine if, let's say, this eastward direction is up a mountain. Well, you wouldn't want this. Let's say these are two big heavy coal trains doing 20 miles an hour. Why would you stop this train and then just start it up again when they could follow each other at restricted speed? So that's a perfect example of where you would see that, you know, instead of this would have a G on it, and it would be restricting instead of stop and proceed. Very similar signal, right? But it's a little bit different. And that goes back to the question of, well, why do we need all these different rules? Because on a grade, it's different than maybe if this was a 90-mile-an-hour high-speed train, right? You might want to have them stop, that sort of thing. But the point here in general is one track for each direction of traffic. Each track only has signals in one direction, and no opposing trains are allowed on the same track. Right? Now, of course, there are scenarios where you might need to do that, and the short answer is the dispatcher can always write a train order to allow you to proceed against the current of traffic, and there's rules for that, but that's outside of the scope of what we're talking here. Double track is the simplest ABS you can get, basically. Now, imagine a single track section, right? Let's say we have a single track railroad, and we've got a passing siding every so often. We need to have traffic move in both directions on the same track. Therefore, we need to have signals in both directions, right? But one of the things that adds a little complexity here is imagine if two trains were approaching each other on these two sections, the same section of single track, right? If they were both 2 blocks away, they would see a clear, they would both see approach, and then they would find themselves colliding, right? What we need to have is an extra yellow. This is generally called the double yellow rule, to provide that extra block of braking distance, assuming the worst case scenario, 2 trains approaching each other at speed, because it's what's called a race condition. Depending on which train hits the signal first, you'll see a clear signal, and then you'll see either stop, or you'll see an approach, and then you'll see a train right in front of you that you're probably going to collide with. So the same rules apply behind us. We've got to have a yellow 1 block behind us, but for a following train, 1 block is enough. But for a train that's approaching in the opposite direction, we need to have that extra second yellow signal to provide an extra block of braking in case they were to approach at speed. As we'll see in a minute, they made a little bit better improvement on that to avoid that whole scenario in the first place. But this is basically what the Santa Fe did in most of where they were. Their sidings, notice, were between the signals. Notice the signals are outside. It's not like CTC, what you see most of the time now, where there's a signal on the siding and a signal on the main track. There's one signal here, and there were rules about how you could open this switch. Basically, you would unlock this switch, and then the signals would go to red, and you would wait a period of time, and if no train showed up, then you could open it up and go. I don't want to get into too much detail, but this is simple and easy, and basically the train will get there eventually. What we figured out later on was we can improve on ABS in single track by adding what was called absolute permissive block. And what this is single track ABS plus what's called traffic locking. And basically, it locks the direction of travel in a single track section between the sidings as soon as a train enters. So it avoids the whole 2 trains coming at each other in the first place. So as soon as a train enters the single track section, all opposing signals all the way to the next siding in the opposite direction go to stop. And that's called tumble down. And I'll show you that in just a second. But the signals at the entrance to these single track sections are absolute. Let me step back in just a second. Notice all these signals have number boards on them. All of these are permissive signals. The signals here outside of the sidings are the most restrictive indication is stop and proceed. In a second, you'll see why these signals here need to be absolute. They can't have a number plate because they have to show stop. But what it does is it prevents opposing trains from entering the same section of single track, and it remains in effect. That tumble down stays in effect as long as there's a train in the block. So here's what it looks like. Here's our single track section, right? We've got a train approaching, but not entering it yet. Notice this signal here doesn't have a number plate, nor does this signal here. The entrance signals to the single track do not have a number plate. And as soon as this westbound train passes that signal, notice all these signals in the opposing direction, all the way back to the signal back here at the next siding go to stop. And what that does is, let's say there's a train sitting either on the siding or in the siding or on the main here, that prevents that train from entering that same section of single track until this train gets all the way through here and clears up, right? And I think that's all I have on it. But imagine a scenario where there's already a train in the block, right? Well, this signal will never clear, right? In and again, this is a lot of how the Santa Fe did things. They did this with APB. It basically allows trains to get where they need to go by themselves without the dispatcher, right? And sorry, my headphones have cut out here. Give me just one quick second. So, you know, the goal on the Santa Fe was to minimize the dispatcher having to handle meets. And that's essentially what APB did for them and for a lot of other railroads, in addition to making things safer, right? You no longer really need the double yellow. You still kind of need it, to not get into too much detail. But again, it allows trains to proceed and allows them to get there faster than they otherwise would. And it doesn't tie up the dispatcher having to handle every meet in the middle of the desert. He may not know the timing of that, and it would keep the dispatcher busy and allow him to, you know, free up and focus on larger concepts of like managing the broader traffic flows and things. So does that make sense? APB, it's basically ABS with traffic locking. As soon as this train enters, the traffic direction is set to westbound, and if that's the case, then all the eastbound signals need to go to stop, right?
I think APB and ABS are the easiest for me to understand.
Mm-hmm. Well, you need to understand those to understand where we're going next with CTC. And the third part of that, before we get to CTC, is interlockings and what those are. As we'll see later on, CTC is basically ABS plus APB plus interlockings, which is ABS plus traffic locking plus interlockings. Right. So let's talk about interlockings. And this is pretty straightforward. I think people have a pretty intuitive understanding of this. What an interlocking is, to define it, is an area where switches and signals are interlocked such that signals only display proceed if the switches are lined up and the route is unoccupied. In other words, you're lined up and it's clear. And there's not a conflicting movement, right? We can't line two trains into the same track or through the same route, right, in a way that they would collide. So switches are lined, the route is unoccupied, and no conflicting movements have been authorized, right? Or we can't authorize a conflicting movement. Also, all signals are absolute, which by definition means that their most restrictive indication is stop, as opposed to stop and proceed or restricting. And the signals will always display stop unless they are cleared by a tower operator, as opposed to ABS, which will show clear unless there's a train there, okay? So let's look at an interlocking. Here's a pretty good example of an interlocking. As you can see, we've got sort of double track ABS, right? We've got track 1 here is signaled for the westbound direction. We've got the triple head here, and the track 2 is signaled for the eastbound direction. Right, and here's the interlocking. Notice we've got double track ABS on either side, and between here and here is the interlocking, this middle section, right? And we would have a tower here where the operator can see the interlocking and see trains and so forth, and the tower operator would control these signals here, signal 8 LNR, signal 10 LNR, and signal 12 LNR, as well as 14L off of this unsignaled branch line, right? And so everything else would be automatic. So this signal back here, notice they have number plates, right? And that's a good hint that a signal is automatic, by the way. If it's permissive, it's typically automatic, generally speaking. So because everything here is at stop, all these automatic signals have to display an appropriate indication. This has to be at approach because the next signal is at stop. Same here. But again, you see we've got 2 heads here and 1 head here. Well, why is that? Well, imagine the next scenario where we're lining a train. Well, it's going to be the second scenario. Train's going through here on the main, right? The tower operator has cleared signal 12R for the main track straight through. So this shows clear. So the previous signal shows clear. But look up here, signal 10L, right? The tower operator has lined the switch to go into the yard and cleared signal 10L for the leftward or westward direction. And therefore, what does the signal system have to show? It has to show restricting because we're going off the main track into a yard. And in this particular case, this would be a pretty good SP example. It would be a lunar white on the bottom. So a train approaching here, right? This signal has to be at approach because this signal is at stop or restricting. In other words, they have to basically stop. Now, what a lot of railroads did, just as a side note, is they would add a second head like this over here. And the bottom head would be white, and it would be yellow over lunar white, which would be approach restricting. If we apply the rules of what we've seen already, what do we think that means? Approach the next signal, prepared to pass it at restricted speed, as opposed to just yellow, which would be approach expecting to stop, right? But anyway, you can see here that the tower operator has allowed this train to enter the yard and an eastbound train to clear through on the main. And I think we'll show that here. Here's the eastbound train has already passed, and now the tower operator has cleared the next eastbound to go down the branch line. Well, this has to be a medium clear, or at least no better than medium clear, right? And this is unsignaled, so this would probably actually be restricting or something. But let's assume that this is not unsignaled. Let's assume this is signaled. You'd get a medium clear here, and look what we get back here. Approach medium, right? If it showed approach, the engineer would be expecting to stop here. Approach medium tells the engineer, not only do you not have to stop, but you're probably going to diverge here, right? So when the engineer comes back here, if he's expecting to go down the branch and he gets approach or clear here, what's he going to do? He's probably going to stop because he knows that he's routed the wrong way, right? So that's a perfect example of where approach medium not only tells you what to do, but it confirms that you're lined up right. It confirms that the dispatcher or the tower operator knows who you are or has done the correct routing. Does that make sense? So this is an interlocking. I think that's about all I can say here. So let's just move right on to CTC then. If there are no questions, I assume there are no questions. CTC basically takes everything we've learned so far as ABS, APB, and interlockings, and basically allows one dispatcher to control many places where you'd otherwise have a tower. So you can see there's a set of double crossovers here. Before CTC, there might be a tower here. And over here at this control point, there might be a tower. And there might be a tower here at what is, looks like a siding or something, right? We go single track and then double track. You would need 3 towers here. Well, what CTC did is it allowed one dispatcher to control vast swaths of territory from one place instead of having a tower everywhere, right? So what is CTC? CTC is APB with all interlocking centrally controlled instead of local towers. And just as a matter of etymology here, in CTC parlance, we call what would otherwise be an interlocking, we call that a control point, because those were places where the dispatcher could control traffic, either by route or by holding a train. In CTC, we have one or more bidirectional main tracks, right? In other words, we have bidirectional ABS with APB, and the signals at the control points are all absolute. Notice all of these signals here don't have a number plate. None of these have the number plate, none of these, and everything else is automatic. These are intermediate signals that the dispatcher doesn't control. They just respond based on track occupancy, switch position, and what the next signal says, right? So you can see here we've got a fairly complex example. We've got an eastbound train here that's approaching, let's call it CP West, right? And the dispatcher has lined this other train on track 1. This is probably a pass, right? So this might be a slow train, and let's say this is Amtrak or some faster train, maybe a hotshot intermodal. He crossed him over probably onto track 1, and now he's going to cross him back over ahead of this train to pass. And he's also got this westbound train approaching that's going to have to stop here and wait. And then once this guy gets across, he can line him through and then line the eastbound to follow, right? Similarly, back here, he's cleared this other westbound to follow him through this control point. So what I see here as a dispatcher is he's got an eastbound that he's passing a slower eastbound, and then he's got 2 westbounds that are pretty much following, and he's going to hold these eastbounds here at CP middle until these guys are gone, and then this guy will probably come out, and then this guy will come out, and so forth. Does that make sense? That's kind of how most dispatching is done these days. And rather than the big lever machine from the 30s, like you saw before, the dispatcher would probably click here. Whoops, sorry, I can't do it. Would click here and then click here, and it would line this route for this train. Similarly, back here, you could click way back here and click all the way here, and it would line everything up in one shot. And it makes the dispatching a lot more efficient for the dispatcher. Instead of having, okay, throw this switch, line this switch and signal, push the button, line this switch and signal, push the button. You can just in 2 clicks just line up to, across a whole division if you wanted to.
Yeah, so I can see as sort of the evolution of all the stuff that we've covered up to that point. This makes the most sense as where we are now,
right?
As sort of the most advanced, if you want to call it that.
It is, and all we've done is basically gotten better with the computers to allow the dispatcher to express that will with a minimum of input. But CTC we've had since the 30s. The lever machines were still CTC. They just didn't have as good an interface for the dispatcher that now computers and microprocessors allow us to do. And so here's a good example of how we have tumble down. We have APB, And with CTC, it doesn't occur when the train occupies it. It occurs as soon as the dispatcher lines the route. So the dispatcher would be in here if he's using a lever machine in the 30s. He lines the switch lever to reverse. He sets the signal lever to the right or to the east, and he pushes the code button. And what will happen is all the opposing signals will go to red, the switch will line, and then this signal will clear. And this is what it will look like. The traffic lock has been established. It sets what's called the direction stick. It's a stick relay that out in the field sets, okay, the traffic is going east, and all of the signals here in each direction look at that relay to determine an additional constraint on whether they can clear. So if the direction stick is against you, you go red, and if every signal does that, you get the tumble down effect. So as soon as the dispatcher lines the route, you get tumble down. Here comes the train proceeding through, and notice that even though the train has passed it, the signals in the opposing direction behind him are still red, right? Until that train clears that section, those signals will still, the traffic lock will stay in place. And then once the train clears it here, then dispatcher can clear the route in the opposite direction, and we can see that the tumble down occurs in the opposite direction, right? And that's CTC, and that is also the end. So again, if the signal's not all red, it's not at all. That's basically the takeaway for you model railroaders. And you know, this is CTC in a nutshell right here. So that's it. That's understanding railroad signals, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present it. This is a good time. I think we went, what, 2 hours? This is about the longest I think we've gone. And it's good. We got into a lot of detail. Great questions.
We had questions along the way. I think normally we would save them until the end, but I think taking questions as you go sometimes is better because there's more context, right? Because you just got done talking about what the question's about. Mm-hmm. Instead of having someone say, remember when you talked about the XYZ a half hour ago? I had a question about that. So,
well, a lot of things become clear as you go through. You know, a lot of folks, I've done this clinic for a few years now, and, I usually tell people, like, by the time this clinic is over, most of your questions will probably be answered. It's just that, you see certain things and then you say, oh, here's an example and let me bring that up. And if you wait 2 slides, I'll get there. But it works either way, because it gives me, and as the speaker, an opportunity to go into detail where it's needed. If I'm talking to professional railroaders, I'm going to talk about different things than if I'm giving this to a model railroad audience. And this clinic is typically geared for, the genesis of this was when I took over operations at the Sacramento Club. We had basically ABS. We were set up for CTC, but it wasn't quite logicked right. And, so I made the signals work correctly. And then it became a question of, getting our operators to understand what they mean and apply it. Now, most of the time, does an approach medium, do you have to slow down your model train? Probably not, but it does tell you if you're lined up right. So in a model railroad context, that's what this clinic was based on. It's SP and WP because that's what we model. And it's geared towards a model railroad audience because, we could go into a million other things that apply to real railroads and big trains that don't really apply to model railroad, braking distances and so forth. So for this clinic, it made a lot more sense to handle it that way because we have a different audience. So definitely.
So I guess we could ask, I would imagine people would have been typing in questions if they still had them. And I'm not seeing a whole bunch of questions rolling in right now.
Yeah.
But we can hang out here for a second and see if anything does, maybe put it out verbally. If anybody has a question related to what we just saw, which again, this is the second time I think that I've seen this clinic, Mike, and it's fascinating. And I think each time so far I've learned something different that I didn't quite get the first time. So,
yeah, I found that it takes about 3 times before people really grok it because as we love to say, the first time you drink it from the fire hose, right? It's like, whoa, all these new concepts, and how do I apply this, and how do I fit that to what I already know and what I've seen as a rail fan or a model railroader or just a student of railroads. And the second time around, you go, okay, like I kind of remember this, and now, okay, yeah, now I get that, and well, what about this, and why lunar and flashing red, and you start getting questions, and then the third time around, you hit it and you're like, okay, now I get it. Like, okay, there, and now I see that. Oh yeah, that timeout on the Tucumcari line with the thing, and so it's the kind of thing that takes some time. The trouble for me is somebody. I've been a road foreman of engines on tourist railroads, and I have to teach volunteers who I have to assume have zero experience, and many of them do. To go through and maybe a one-day rules class, couple hours. all of these concepts, not just signaling, but railroad rules in general. And, when you go work for a UP or CSX, they send you to school for weeks to learn this stuff. Signaling is a couple of weeks. I mean, it takes time. And then, of course, you're out in the field and you get context and all that other stuff. That's what makes it a fire hose, is we're trying to pack what would be for professional railroaders who do this day in and day out for years and who have weeks or months of training into an hour.
Right.
It's just necessarily complex. So yeah, it's a good, I mean, this is a plug for coming back to my clinic, but you watch this or you hear it a couple times, it eventually clicks, because it's just a lot to learn in a short period of time. But yeah, thanks for the compliment. I think I've got it refined. I used to do the CTC and ABS part first and then do the aspects and indications. And I found from experience that it makes more sense to just go right for the complex stuff, which is the signal aspects, and then apply it in the larger context of dispatcher. And that was a key thing for me a couple of years ago. After the first or second time I did it, I switched those around, and that made it a lot easier for folks to understand as well.
Yeah. I think if it matters at all, I think the order of it is good. I think it's a matter of, it would be easier. When I was in high school, I took Algebra 1 and I didn't do well because it was too much all at once of stuff that I didn't understand.
Yeah.
So I ended up having to take Algebra 1A and then Algebra 1B. So what that was Algebra 1 put into 2 years. Right. I could see doing Signals 1 and Signals 2, or Signals 101A and 101B, if you will, with this, because it does fill up the entire hour. I mean, the first time I saw you do this was I think it was for the club. That was a virtual meeting, and it took up the entire hour, and it was so much information. And that's why it was that fire hose effect that we were talking about before.
Yeah, if this was like an NMRA convention or something, I would probably break it into like a few hour-long segments. I could probably do an hour just on the basics of, aspect name and indication, and, then get into here's how we apply it, right? Yep. And then CTC, ABI. I could do an hour just on CTC. I mean, there's a lot of detail that we don't really cover because, like I said, it's just too much, and you don't want to make it so simple. Like, all right, 3 colors. We could talk about that for maybe 15 minutes, I guess. But there's always a balance of having the appropriate level of complexity without having too much, and making it audience appropriate. If this was just for model railroaders, I would approach it one way. If it was for professional railroaders, I would approach it differently. And if it was for a general audience, it would be much different, much slower. There's a lot of knowledge that you folks have, being rail fans or model railroaders, that the general public doesn't have at all. And so it's really hard to make this work for every audience, is really what it boils down to. It's really a question of how much background knowledge you have and how much experience you have in general with railroads. Right.
I think in our case, we have a pretty decent cross section of all of the above, so it works. And I thank you. I think it's a great bit of info, and I know a guy that's might be looking to get some clinic content for a national convention. That's an NMRA convention. Maybe we can talk about maybe doing a shortened version of the first half or something like that for that, because that's coming up in July, and I think we have enough, but I don't know that we'll have enough recorded in time for what we're trying to do.
Yeah, we'd probably want to break it up. If I were going to do it for an NMRA clinic, it'd probably be an all-day track, and I would break this up into, at least 3 sections, I would think. Right. And
because you can get into much more detail, because I'm sure that audience would want to know more specifically how to apply stuff. So.
Yeah, I mean, again, the key concept here is sort of the demystification, right? The thing for me, and I've heard many folks say this to me and independently, is that I don't get, why are they the colors and the positions that they are? What's the rhyme and the reason to it? And when you first look at it, it seems like arbitrary. It seems completely like, well, they just picked stuff. And as we've seen and as we've shown, there is a rhyme and a reason to it. The only thing that doesn't really make sense is the double yellow, right? Because they had to do something and there was nothing left. But everything else is, again, those principles that we talked about, the 3 heads and the 3 speeds. And everything else is really just a question of, like, what did your railroad do? And if you grew up on, the New York Central, they did things the New York Central way. If you grew up on the C&O, they did things a little bit differently. If you grew up on the B&O, it was the color position lights. The principles were the same, but their implementation of aspects was different. So, you know, it's the kind of thing that you can be as complex and deep as you want. But my goal with this clinic is to provide the demystification of the basics, so you can get a general idea of like, how does this work? You know, is this clinic going to prepare you to pass a signal rules exam at UP? No, not necessarily. But it will allow you, if you're a model railroad, to understand how to obey them. If you're on a big railroad that has signals, how to maybe think about designing a signal system for your railroad. I could do a whole clinic just on that, because, you know, the principles that we talk about, not only do you have to think about that when designing the signal system for your model railroad, you also have to think about how you're going to design your model railroad if you want signals, right? One of the things that I often see with a model railroad audience is they build a layout or they design a layout and then they try to put signals on it after the fact. And what you'll find out is that you really have to think about signaling as part of the design process on your model railroad. At the SAC Club, they designed the railroad pretty well, but they didn't, I don't think they had signals in mind when they designed it, which speaks to their design sensibility. But there are a couple things that we probably would have done a little bit differently if we had planned for CTC. For example, you may not be able to see every signal if it's a certain place in your railroad. You're standing here and it's facing the other way, or it's in a tight spot or whatever. Repeaters, right, or something you need to think about. You need to think about how spaced out your signals need to be. And as a general rule of thumb, more signals, more gooder. Shorter blocks and more of them is better than less blocks that are longer. But the point is, we could talk about that in an NMRA context of layout design or operations design, and that impacts how your car forwarding might work or how your operating rules might work, whether you use radios or not. It all goes into the design part. So the tip I would give people is think about signaling as part of design.
Yeah, you know, the more I think about it too, you can apply, for example, if you like the way Santa Fe did their signal, just pulling a name out of the hat, but you're going to do a freelance thing, you can still use the signals that the signal protocols that they had in order to run your own model railroad. You don't have to just come up with a completely reinvent the wheel on your own, because you don't have, because you're doing a freelance. Adopt whatever one you like, right? And then design for that. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. But here's one of the things that I often will come up with in my own sort of train of thought is, you have to know the stuff. You have to know enough to ask the right questions, because if you don't know enough, you don't even know, you don't even know where to start with signals. I would just, if I didn't know anything, I would just think, oh, ABS is good enough, just put that on. Whatever.
Well, and even that is a step ahead. What I see a lot is, like I said, you don't know what you don't know. But what I see on a lot of beginner model railroads is they just place signals where they think they should be, right? Which is not necessarily going to achieve the goal that you want, which is usually train control. Now, for some folks, maybe if you're, I don't know, a 3-rail-O guy and, you just want some simple animation, and, there's very simple systems where, you put a signal on and basically the train goes by, it goes to red, and then just waits a certain amount of time, it goes to yellow and then goes to green. For some people, that's enough. If you want true CTC control, and you've got a big, busy club layout and you've got to manage a lot of trains, CTC probably makes sense, and everything in between. But what I see a lot of is people sort of reinventing the wheel. Like, there's no reason to do that. What you will find most times is it doesn't do what you want it to do. And that's what this clinic is about sort of exposing the broad concepts and going, here's the simplest thing, right? One signal, 3 colors, single track, ABS, right? To all the way up to CTC, and then you can know what you don't know and go, okay, even if I don't want CTC, well, I'm not going to put a signal in the wrong place because it's not going to help. It's not going to do what I want it to do. So, and the signal manufacturers know that. If you're a modeler, there's everything from that system. I forget who makes it, but it's just a timer, basically. Some of them literally just sort of change randomly, if we just want animation and things. But I think most people at some level want realism. That's what modeling is, right? Is we're simulating some real thing. And the question is, how much time, money, and effort do we want to spend, and how real do we care about? But even with simple, basic double track ABS or even single track, you can get most of what you want pretty simple if you ask the right questions.
Yep. And
Totally.
like I said, knowing the questions to ask, that's the real key, I think.
And that's what this is about.
Yeah, and information like this clinic, I think, gives people a whole lot of information to sort of inform that line of question that they might need to ask. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. One thing I want to mention, and I want to keep you on for just a second because it kind of relates to, it's an invitation to you. I don't know, I haven't checked again recently, but one of the upcoming programs that we have is about JMRI. We're doing that a week from tomorrow. And the last time I checked, Mike, there was still a slot available on the panel. So just if you're not busy, and I can send you the link for that if you're interested in being on it. I didn't know. When you signed up or when we talked and you agreed to do this, I didn't know if you'd want to be on 2 weeks in a row, but the information is good. And I know you know about JMRI.
I don't know if your audience wants me on 2 weeks in a row either, but I've done the CTC implementation with the Sacramento Model Railroad Historical Society using JMRI. I can certainly speak to it. It'd probably be better, if it was a panel or something. Like, I don't have a clinic ready to go on how to do that.
It's a panel. It's our monthly panel. I think you were on one before.
Yeah.
I don't remember. Oh, we were talking about traffic control, so it was a lot like what we're talking about here.
Let me get back to you, but maybe I'll say definitely maybe.
Definitely maybe. That's kind of like you might like this for sure.
Yeah. I mean, there's a time and a place for places and times, and
okay.
No, totally. Yeah, no.
No, yeah.
What?
Yeah, no.
Yeah, no. Go ahead and back up. That's fine.
Right. Go ahead and back up.
Go ahead and back them up. Yeah.
That's a good one. But one of the other things that I'll mention here is just based on the questions that we saw and kind of these compliments really that came in on the chats. I'm thinking the audience probably wouldn't mind having to tolerate you twice in 2 weeks. So, but anyway.
Right. Yeah, so shoot me a link. Time.
I do want to also mention to the audience here, why don't I put you back backstage, Mike, and we'll wrap up here, and I'll talk to you in just a minute, all right?
All right, thanks, guys. See us. Thanks for coming.
Yep. Thanks again. I really appreciate it. And
my pleasure.
I'll talk to you in a minute. Okay, so that'll do it for this show. We did go a little bit longer than either one of us expected, but it's okay because the information was excellent as usual. And I do want to mention also a week from today, we have what I call the 5th Saturday of the month because May this year has 5 Saturdays. So I have a special presentation it's basically my tribute to Amtrak's 50th anniversary. So it's a compilation. It's like a half-hour long, probably 50 or 60 or 70 some odd run-bys of Amtrak trains that I've caught over the past, decade and a half that I've been doing this. And they're all long-distance trains. There's none of the Amtrak California or Surfliners. It's all Amtrak proper. So with that, I will bid you a great weekend and hope to see you soon.